Barrett Crow didn't even wait for the wedding rice to hit the ground. He walked straight up to Clara Whitlock's father, a man so hollowed out by drought and debt that his hands shook even on a good day, and he pressed a folded newspaper into those trembling hands with a smile that never once reached his eyes. Thought the family deserved to know, Crow said, loud enough for half of Red Hollow to hear, exactly what kind of man their daughter just married. The headline read, "Rourke Rancher Blamed in Deaths of Wife and Child." Clara was still standing in her wedding dress. She hadn't even taken off her veil. And the man she had just married, the man she knew almost nothing about, was already walking toward the mountain road, with her trunk loaded on his wagon, his back turned to the crowd, saying nothing. Not one word. If you've ever been handed a truth you weren't ready for, if you've ever stood in a room full of people while the floor disappeared beneath your feet, then you already understand what Clara felt in that moment. And if you've ever been judged for something you didn't do, you'll understand what Gideon felt too. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The morning Clara Whitlock agreed to marry a stranger, she was standing in a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and old flour, watching her mother count the same 7 coins for the 3rd time. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no argument, no ultimatum, no father pounding his fist on a table. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it worse. Her mother just kept counting, 7 coins, 6. She'd move one aside, count again. Her lips moved without sound. Clara stood in the doorway and understood, with the kind of certainty that settles into your chest and stays there, that they had run out of road. The drought had taken the wheat, the winter had taken 2 of their cattle and a portion of the roof. Her younger brother still hadn't recovered his full strength after the fever that swept through Red Hollow the previous autumn. And her father, Thomas Whitlock, who had once been a man who laughed too loud at his own jokes and smelled like cedar and honest work, had aged 10 years in the span of 2. He moved slowly now. He apologized for things that weren't his fault. So when Reverend Marsh came to the house that Tuesday and sat down across from her father with his hat in his lap and said that Gideon Rourke of Blackthorn Valley was looking for a wife, Clara didn't run from the room. She didn't cry. She pulled out a chair and sat down and asked what she needed to know. The Reverend told her what most of Red Hollow believed. That Gideon Rourke was a hard man, solitary, that he'd had a wife and daughter once, and that both of them had died, and that the town had its own ideas about why. He wasn't violent, the Reverend said carefully, not that anyone could prove. He paid his debts, he traded fair, but he was the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid, and he had not set foot in town in nearly 3 years. He's offering fair compensation to the family, Reverend Marsh said to her father, still not looking at Clara directly. And he's asking for a wife who can manage a working ranch. What does he want with a wife? Clara asked. The Reverend finally looked at her. He didn't say. That should have been enough to end the conversation. Any sensible 19-year-old girl with options would have stood up from that table and walked back to whatever life she had. But Clara looked at her mother's hands, still resting flat on the table now, coins pushed to the side, and she thought about her brother's cough, and the roof, and the 7 coins. Tell him yes, she said. Her father's head came up fast. Clara, tell him yes, Papa. She met Gideon Rourke for the first time on the morning of their wedding. He was waiting outside the church when she arrived with her father, standing beside a wagon that had seen better decades, wearing a coat that was clean but not new. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader, the kind of man who took up space without seeming to know it. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, and he had a jaw that looked like it had been set against something difficult for a very long time. He didn't smile when he saw her. He didn't look her over the way some men did, like they were assessing livestock. He just met her eyes and gave a single slow nod, like they'd made a business agreement and he intended to honor it. That nod told her more than anything Reverend Marsh had said. This was a man who had learned not to expect warmth from the world. He wasn't going to perform charm he didn't feel. She respected that, even as it frightened her. The ceremony was short. Reverend Marsh kept his voice steady, though Clara noticed he didn't linger on the part about love. The pews held maybe 20 people neighbors who'd come more out of curiosity than goodwill, a few women who'd known Clara's mother for years, and looked at Clara now with expressions that fell somewhere between pity and grief. One of them pressed her hand afterward and didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Gideon shook her father's hand at the church door. Whatever passed between them, it was brief. Her father nodded once. He hugged Clara for a long time, longer than he usually did, and she could feel his ribs through his shirt. "You write us," he said into her hair. "I will, Papa. You write us the moment you need anything." She pulled back and looked at his face and made herself smile like she meant it. "I'll be fine." She didn't know yet whether that was true. It was Barrett Crow who made the first real mark on that day. She had barely turned from her father when she heard Crow's voice, smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once worried about where his next meal was coming from. He was standing near the church steps with a folded newspaper in one hand, and that particular kind of smile that men like him wore when they were about to do something they'd enjoy. He handed the paper to her father, not to her father deliberately where everyone could see. Thomas Whitlock looked down at the headline. The color left his face. Clara crossed the space between them in 3 steps and took the paper from her father's hands before he could fully process it. She read the headline. She read the first paragraph. Then she looked up. Gideon was already at the wagon. He hadn't seen any of it, or if he had, he gave no sign. He was checking the horse's harness, his back to the crowd, with the practiced ease of a man who had long since stopped turning around to see what people thought of him. "You should read the rest of it," Crow said to her, still smiling. "Before you go up that mountain." Clara folded the paper and held it against her side. Her heart was hammering, but she kept her face still. 19 years old, standing in a wedding dress in front of a crowd of people who already pitied her, holding a newspaper that accused her husband of something monstrous, and she had exactly 2 choices. Fold right there on those church steps, or get on the wagon. She walked to the wagon. She did not read the rest of the article until that night. The road into Blackthorn Valley took nearly 4 hours, and most of it was silence. Not uncomfortable silence, exactly. More like 2 people who understood that small talk would be dishonest and had agreed without words to skip it. Gideon drove. Clara sat beside him on the wagon bench with her coat pulled close, watching the landscape change as they climbed the flat scrubland of Red Hollow, giving way to pine slopes, the air cooling and sharpening around them. About an hour in, it started to snow, not heavily. Just a sifting of fine white, the kind that didn't accumulate yet, but made everything feel more serious. Clara watched it and thought about what her mother would be doing right now. Probably putting her brother to bed early to save on the fire. Probably counting those coins again. "You cold?" Gideon's voice was low. Not unkind, but careful, like he was testing whether conversation was allowed. "I'm fine," she said. He reached behind the bench without another word and pulled out a coat-heavy canvas, wool-lined, and held it out to her. She took it after a moment. It smelled like cedar and wood smoke, and it was enormous on her, the sleeves falling past her hands. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and turned back to the road. She pulled the coat tighter and decided not to think about the newspaper in her bag. The bridge was the first real moment of danger, though it happened quickly enough that she almost didn't understand it was danger until it was over. They were crossing a narrow wooden structure above a creek that ran fast with snowmelt, and her horse, she'd kept her own mare, tied to the back of the wagon, shied sideways without warning. The rope jerked, the wagon lurched right, and Clara grabbed the bench rail with both hands as the wheels skidded toward the edge. Gideon had the reins pulled hard before she'd finished the thought. Not panicked, not shouting, just a fast, decisive haul that steadied the lead horse and brought everything back to center. He held the tension for 3 long seconds, letting the animals settle, then eased them forward at a walk until they cleared the bridge. Her mare whinnied unhappily from behind. She was fine. Clara realized she had been holding her breath. "She spooks at water," Gideon said, nodding toward the mare. "She does," Clara said. "She always has. I'll build her a better run." Away from the creek, Clara looked at him. He said it without ceremony, like it was simply the next practical thing on a list of practical things. Not a kindness, just sense. But she noticed. She filed it away with the coat and the careful silence. The ranch appeared through the tree line as the last of the daylight was going gray. It was not what she'd feared and not what she'd hoped for. A solid cabin, not large but not crumbling, a barn in better repair than the house. A fence line that had been recently mended, she could see the new posts, lighter in color than the old ones. Smoke was coming from the chimney, which meant he'd left a fire banked before leaving that morning. Planned ahead, thought about her arriving cold. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. He carried her trunk inside without asking whether she wanted help. She followed him through the door and stood in the middle of the main room while he set the trunk down and straightened up. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, somewhere between uncertainty and resignation. And then he said, "The bedroom's through there. It's warmer. The stove drafts a little on the left side. Just keep the damper halfway." She looked at the door he'd indicated. "Where will you sleep?" "Back room. That's hardly more than a closet, I expect." "It suits me." She almost said something else. Something about fairness, or about how she wasn't going to take the man's own room. But something in his voice stopped her, not authority, not coldness. Something more like a decision he'd already made a long time ago, before she'd ever arrived. Like he had thought through exactly what this arrangement would look like and had drawn his own lines around it. "All right," she said. He nodded. "There's stew on the back of the stove." It should still be warm. He was gone through the back room door before she could answer. Clara sat alone at the table that first night and ate the stew venison, root vegetables, a broth that had been simmering for hours, and she thought about the newspaper folded in her bag. She took it out. She read it this time, all of it. The article was 4 years old, reprinted from a publication she didn't recognize. It described Gideon Rourke as a man of volcanic temper and deliberate cruelty who had driven his wife to an early grave and neglected his daughter in her final illness. It quoted unnamed sources. It used language that was careful enough to avoid legal trouble, but devastating enough to destroy a reputation. She could see the craft in it. Someone had written this to do a specific kind of damage. She folded it again and set it on the table. She didn't know what to believe. She had no witnesses, no one to ask, and the man himself was 6 feet away in a room that probably didn't have space for his elbows. He had not touched her. He had not spoken harshly. He had given her his coat and his bedroom and a meal he'd prepared before dawn on the morning of their wedding. That didn't make the article wrong, but it didn't make it right either. She found the wooden bird later, when she was unpacking her trunk into the small wardrobe beside the bed. It was sitting on the shelf above the wardrobe, a carving, small enough to fit in her palm, a swallow in mid-flight. Smooth, with handling. And on the base, in careful, small letters, L. R. Lucy Rourke. Clara stood holding it for a long time. Then she set it back exactly where she'd found it, in exactly the same position, as if it hadn't been moved at all. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her fingers against her eyes, and let herself cry quietly, because the wall was thin and she didn't know this man. And the last thing she wanted was for him to hear her and think she was weak, or ungrateful, or afraid. She was all three, if she was honest. But she cried hardest for a different reason than anyone looking in might have guessed. She cried because of the bird, because of those 2 initials. Because she had walked into this house already carrying her own grief for her family, for the life she hadn't been given, for the version of herself who'd wanted something different and she had found, without looking for it, evidence that the man in the next room was carrying grief that made hers feel small. A child had lived in this cabin. A child was gone. And the man who had carved that bird with his own hands, who had placed it there like a small and private vigil, was sleeping in a closet so that the stranger he'd married wouldn't have to be uncomfortable on her first night. Clara lay back on the bed with her arm over her eyes and stared at the ceiling in the dark. Who is this man? She didn't have the answer, but for the first time since she'd agreed to any of this, she understood that the answer mattered, that she needed to find it, that whatever the newspaper said, whatever Red Hollow whispered, whatever Barrett Crow's smile had promised back on those church steps, there was something in this house that the rumors had never touched. And she was going to find out what it was. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest. She could hear it pressing against the window, that particular hush that heavy snowfall brings, as if the world was being muffled for reasons of its own. Inside the cabin, the stove ticked softly. Somewhere in the barn, her mare was safe and out of the cold. Gideon Rourke had thought to stable her before the weather turned. Clara closed her eyes. She had not married love. She knew that. But she was beginning to suspect she had married something more complicated than a monster, and that the distance between those two things was going to determine everything about the life she was now living. Question was whether she had enough courage to cross it. She woke before dawn to the sound of an axe, not frantic rhythmic. The steady crack and split of wood being worked with patience and long practice. Clara lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar bed, in the unfamiliar dark, and listened to it. One strike, a pause, the clean sound of wood giving way. Another strike. She had grown up hearing her father chop wood in the mornings, but his rhythm had always been hurried, like a man racing a clock he was already losing. This was different. This was someone who understood exactly how much work the morning held and had made peace with all of it. She got up, dressed quickly against the cold, and stood at the window. Gideon was in the yard below, coat open, despite the temperature, working through a stack of logs that was taller than she'd realized the night before. He split each one with the same unhurried economy, read it, one clean swing. No wasted motion. She watched for longer than she intended, and then she turned away and started the stove. When he came in 20 minutes later, she had coffee on and was attempting to find her way around a kitchen that was organized according to a logic she hadn't learned yet. She'd opened 3 wrong cabinets looking for the salt. She didn't say that. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the coffee, then at her, in a way that seemed to catch him slightly off guard. Like he'd already mentally prepared for the morning to go a certain way, and this was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I was up," she said. "Sit down, it's ready." He sat. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and took the chair across the table, and they drank coffee together in the gray morning light without talking, and it was the most normal thing that had happened since she'd arrived. After a while he said, "I'm going up to the north fence line. Storm brought a section down. I'll be back by midday." "I'll figure out the kitchen," she said. "Pantry's behind the door on the left. Dried beans, salt pork, whatever you need." "Thank you." He picked up his cup, finished it, set it down. Stood. Then he paused at the door with his back to her and said, without turning around, "There's snowshoes on the back wall of the barn. If you want to walk. The valley's it's worth seeing in the snow." He left before she could respond. Clara looked at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she looked at her coffee. Then she almost smiled and wasn't entirely sure why. She spent the first week learning the ranch the way you learn a language, slowly by guessing wrong and correcting. The pantry made sense once she understood how he'd organized it, by how often things were needed rather than by what they were. Stove's bad draft on the left side was real, and she learned to compensate after scorching the bottom of a cornbread she'd been proud of. She found 3 different tools in the barn she couldn't identify and didn't ask about, deciding she'd figure them out before admitting ignorance. Gideon worked. That was the simplest description of him in those early days. He rose before light, worked until the light was gone, and spent the narrow hours between supper and sleep either reading or sharpening tools or doing nothing she could see from across the room. He wasn't distant in a cold way. He was distant in the way of someone who had spent years learning to need very little and had gotten very good at it. He did, however, do small things she noticed. He refilled the woodbox without being asked, always before she went to bed so the morning fire was easy. He fixed the warped door on the chicken coop without mentioning it, so she only realized it when she went out one morning and found it swinging cleanly for the first time. When she burned her hand on the stove edge her third day there, not badly, just enough to raise a red line across her palm, he crossed the room without ceremony, looked at it, went to the shelf above the wash basin, and came back with a jar of something dark and herbal that he spread across the burn with careful, impersonal hands. "Keep it wrapped today," he said. "I've burned myself before," she said. Not sharply. "Just honestly, I know," he said. "Keep it wrapped anyway." That was the longest medical conversation they had. It was the end of her second week when she found the graves. She had taken the snowshoes out, he'd been right. The valley in snow was something she didn't have words for. The kind of landscape that made you feel very small in a way that wasn't unpleasant, and she'd walked the fence line south along the creek further than she'd gone before. Cottonwood stood at the edge of a small clearing, old and enormous, and she almost walked past the stones before she understood what they were. 2 markers, not expensive, not ornate. Someone had cut them from local stone and carved the letters himself. She could see that from the uneven depth of the cuts. The work of a person who was not a stonemason but had refused to leave the job to someone else. Clara Rourke, beloved Lucy Rourke, 4 years. Always. Clara stood in front of those 2 stones for a long time. The snow had banked against the base of them, and someone, and she knew, even without any evidence, that it had been Gideon had cleared it away recently. The stone was clean. There were no flowers in winter, but a small piece of carved wood was propped against Lucy's marker. A bird, different from the one on the wardrobe shelf, but the same hand, the same patient detail. He came here, regularly, in weather that would have kept most men indoors. Clara crouched in the snow and looked at the smaller stone for a long time. 4 years. Lucy Rourke had been 4 years old. She thought about the bird in the bedroom, the initials on its base, the careful way it had been placed. She thought about a man carving small birds in the evenings by firelight in the back room that was barely big enough for a cot, alone in this valley for however many years it had been since these stones were set. She stood up and walked back to the cabin and didn't say anything about it. Walter Fenwick arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Clara had come to Blackthorn Valley, driving a mule cart with a broken spoke he'd apparently decided was someone else's problem. He was 60-some years old, wide as a barn door, and had the particular manner of a man who had outlived most of his patience for social niceties. He looked at Clara when Gideon introduced her and said, "Well, you're younger than I figured. I get that a lot," Clara said. He laughed a real laugh, the sudden kind, and that was how they became something close to friends. Walter's land bordered Gideon's to the east, and he'd been coming and going from Blackthorn Valley for longer than Gideon had owned it. He was the closest thing Gideon had to a neighbor, and as far as Clara could tell, the closest thing he had to a friend. They spoke to each other in the economical way of men who had long since gotten past the need to fill silence, which Clara found oddly comforting to watch. While Gideon replaced Walter's spoke in the barn, Clara brought coffee out and sat on an upturned crate and talked to Walter because he was the first person in 3 weeks who wanted to. "How long have you known him?" she asked. 12 years, near enough," Walter said. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out toward the barn. "Knew him before, too. Before Mara got sick. He was different then." Clara waited. "Not a different person," Walter said, correcting himself. "Same man, but lighter. You know what I mean? Like before a thing happens to a person that they don't come back from all the way." "What happened to Mara?" Clara asked. She'd been waiting 3 weeks to ask someone. Walter looked at her with an expression that took its time deciding something. Then he said, "What did they tell you in town?" "That he was responsible." The old man made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Yeah, that's what they said. He told her the rest of it slowly, without drama, in the plain way of someone recounting something he'd witnessed himself. The winter 4 years back had been the worst in living memory. January had come in with a storm that shut every road out of the valley for 11 days. Mara had fallen ill at the start of it, not with something simple. Something that moved fast and needed medicine they didn't have. By the time the storm broke enough to ride through, she was already bad. Very bad. He rode 30 miles, Walter said, through snow that would have killed most men. Got to town, got the doctor, started back. He paused. They made it to the bridge south of the valley, and the road was gone. Ice had taken it out. They had to go around, another 6 miles. By the time they got back, he stopped, turned his cup in his hands. Mara had gone that morning. Lucy held on another 4 days, but she was too little. She just wasn't strong enough without her mother. The yard was very quiet. Why did they blame him? Clara said, though part of her already knew the answer had nothing to do with justice. Because people needed someone to blame, and he was there, Walter said. And because he didn't defend himself, not once, not a single word. He just closed up, stopped coming to town, stopped talking to anyone but me. And silence looks like guilt to people who've already decided what they believe. Clara thought about the newspaper. She thought about Barrett Crow's smile at the church steps. She thought about how carefully that article had been written, how it quoted no witnesses, named no sources, but built its case with language that stopped just short of being a lie while doing exactly as much damage as one. Walter, she said, do you know a man named Barrett Crow? The old man went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of someone who had just heard a word they'd been half waiting for. Where did you hear that name? He said. He was at the wedding, she said. He had a newspaper. He gave it to my father. Walter set his coffee mug down on the ground beside the crate. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her, and whatever decision he'd been weighing, he made it. That man, Walter said carefully, has been trying to get his hands on this valley for 6 years. The conversation with Walter changed the shape of everything Clara thought she'd been looking at. She didn't tell Gideon what Walter had said, not right away. She needed time to think about it, to turn the information over and look at its edges. She was not someone who ran toward conclusions. She'd been in too many situations where the first version of a story turned out to be the version someone wanted her to believe. But she did start paying attention differently. She started paying attention to the letters. She'd noticed a locked box on the shelf in Gideon's back room when she'd gone in once to bring clean laundry. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't touched it, but 3 days after her conversation with Walter, she came into the main room to find Gideon sitting at the table with the box open in front of him and a small stack of papers spread out. He looked up when she came in, and he didn't move to cover them, which surprised her. Sit down, he said, not a command. More like an offer he wasn't sure she'd take. She sat. He pushed one of the papers toward her. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 6 years back. The handwriting was precise and cold, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who cared about being seen as precise and cold. She read it. It was from someone who signed himself only with initials B. C, and it was addressed to the editor of a publication she didn't recognize. It discussed, in very careful language, the possibility of printing a story about a valley rancher of questionable character, and how such a story might be of interest to certain investors in the region who were looking at land acquisitions in that particular area. She looked up. Where did you get this? She asked. Walter, Gideon said. He kept it. He didn't know what it was at the time, thought it was misdirected mail. Took him a couple of years to understand what he was holding. Barrett Crow, she said. Gideon looked at her without surprise. Walter told you. He told me some of it. There was a long pause. Gideon gathered the papers back into a rough stack but didn't put them away. He rested one hand flat on top of them and looked at the table, not at her, and she waited. He came to me 2 months before you arrived, Gideon said. Offered to buy the valley. Said it was a fair price. He paused. It wasn't a fair price. You said no. I said no. And then he came to our wedding and handed my father a newspaper. Something moved across Gideon's face. She'd learned by now to watch for the small movements because the large ones almost never came. This one was brief and tight, and it looked like anger being pressed back down from a long habit of pressing it down. I didn't know he was going to do that, he said. I didn't think you did, she said. He looked up at her, then. She held his gaze, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and she had the peculiar sensation that something had just shifted, not dramatically, not irreversibly, but shifted. Like a door that had been stuck for a long time had moved a quarter inch. Why does he want the valley that badly? She asked. Gideon folded his hands. I wasn't sure until recently. Walter found something last fall. There's gold in the northern ridge. Clara heard those words land in the quiet of the cabin and understood their weight. He's known this whole time, she said. Likely since before the newspaper ran, Gideon said. She sat with that for a moment, the scale of it, the patience of it. A man who had decided that a rancher's grief and reputation were acceptable costs, who had waited years for isolation and shame to do the work that money hadn't managed. What are you going to do? She asked. Nothing, Gideon said. She stared at him. Nothing. He can't take the land. It's mine, legally. I'm not leaving. He doesn't need you to leave, Clara said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and didn't soften it. He needs you to stay exactly like this. Alone up here, no one in town who'll speak for you. Nothing between him and whatever story he decides to tell next. He's patient, Gideon. Patient men don't stop. Gideon looked at her for a long time without answering. Then he picked up the papers, put them back in the box, and closed the lid. Go to bed, Clara, he said, not unkindly, but done. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and she thought about patience and about the kind of damage that gets done when a good person decides that silence is the only dignified response to lies. She thought about Lucy's gravestone in the snow and the cleared stone and the small bird propped against it. She thought, someone should have stood beside him a long time ago. She wasn't ready yet. She needed to understand more. But the thought had taken root. The next 2 weeks brought a thaw, and then a freeze, and then a thaw again, which was its own kind of conversation, the land making up its mind while everything on it waited. Clara learned to read the sky the way Gideon did, with practical attention rather than wonder, because weather here was not scenery, it was information. She learned which roof sections needed watching when the ice shifted. She learned that the black mare in the third stall had a shoulder injury that flared in the cold and needed rubbing down with liniment on the mornings the temperature dropped fast. Nobody told her. She noticed. Gideon noticed her noticing. He didn't comment on it directly, that wasn't his way, but she caught him watching her sometimes from across the yard or the barn, with an expression she'd learned to recognize, slightly off balance, like a man recalculating something he thought he'd already figured out. They were not yet close. They were something more complicated than close. They were two people who had been placed in the same life and were slowly, cautiously, learning each other's architecture, the load-bearing walls, the places that were still soft and damaged, the rooms where the other person was not yet invited. One night she asked him about Lucy. It was late. The fire had burned down to coals. They were sitting on opposite sides of the main room, she with the mending, he with nothing particular in his hands, which was rare enough that she'd noticed. She looked up from her work and said, "Will you tell me about her?" She expected him to shut down. She was prepared for it. But he didn't move away or close off. He looked at the fire for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that was quiet and careful, like he was handling something fragile, she liked birds. "I know," Clara said, "the carvings." He looked at her. "You found them." "I found the one in the bedroom." "I saw the one at her grave." He didn't answer for a moment. Then he said, "She used to collect feathers. Couldn't tell you what kind she was for. She didn't care what kind. She just liked them, kept them in a cup on the windowsill." He stopped. "Cup broke when I was cleaning the room. I couldn't." He stopped again, shorter this time. So you carved them instead, Clara said. He turned his head away toward the window. Outside, the snow had started again light this time. She used to call them the flying ones, he said, and something in his voice had gone rough around the edges in a way he clearly hadn't intended. Every bird she ever saw, look, the flying ones, like it was the most remarkable thing in the world that something could just leave the ground like that. Clara set down the mending. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would add to what he'd just offered, and she was afraid of subtracting from it. They sat in silence while the snow came down, and this silence felt different from all the other silences Fuller, somehow. Less like absence and more like something actually present. It was Walter who brought her the old newspaper the following week. Not the reprint that Crow had given her father, but an earlier one. Older one that predated Mara's death by 2 years. He came in the morning while Gideon was out on the far end of the property, and he sat at Clara's table and spread the thing out with the deliberate care of a man presenting evidence at a trial. I want you to read the letters column, he said. 3rd page bottom. She read it. It was a letter from a rancher in the Blackthorn region, praising a neighbor who had rebuilt a family's barn after a fire without charging a cent. The neighbor was not named in the letter, but Walter pointed to the margin, where someone had written in pencil, long ago, Rourke again. He did that kind of thing, Walter said quietly. Didn't want the credit, didn't want the conversation. Just did it and came home. Walter folded his hands on the table. There are 6 families I know of personally who Gideon helped in some significant way during those years. Feed when their crops failed, fence work, lumber, a doctor's bill he paid anonymously for a family he'd barely met. I only know about it because the doctor told me by accident. Clara looked at the paper, then she looked at Walter. Why didn't anyone say this, she said. When the story started, why didn't anyone stand up and say this? Walter was quiet for a moment. Some tried, he said. God ignored. Crow has money. Money buys the kind of credibility that crowds out other voices. And Gideon never asked anyone to defend him. Made it hard to do it without feeling like you were overstepping. And now? Walter looked at her steadily. He had a particular way of looking at a person, this old man, direct and without agenda, like someone who had given up on subtlety late in life and found it was the best decision he'd ever made. Now he has a wife, Walter said. Whether that changes anything depends on the wife. Clara took a walk that evening alone, without the snowshoes this time, just to the edge of the yard where the cottonwood was visible through the tree line. She couldn't see the graves from this distance, just the shape of the old tree against the sky. She thought about what she'd agreed to when she married Gideon Rourke. She had agreed to a transaction her situation for her family's security. She had expected hardship, distance, possibly worse. She had not expected to find herself standing at the edge of a man's life, looking in at something that was real and broken and wronged in ways that no one had bothered to notice. She was not in love with him. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. But she had come to something more immediate than love. She had come to believe in him. And belief, she thought, required something that love sometimes didn't. Belief required action. She walked back to the cabin. Gideon was at the table, reading. He looked up when she came in. I want to ask you something, she said. He closed the book. Waited. The people you helped over the years, the families Walter told me about, do you think they'd speak for you? If someone asked them to? Something in his face went very still. Clara, do you think they would? It doesn't matter, he said. It does matter, she said. It matters a great deal. Crow built your reputation on silence and absence. Every year you stay up here and say nothing, he wins a little more ground without firing a single shot. You keep the land, but you lose everything else. And eventually nothing, Gideon said, and his voice had an edge now. He can't take what's mine. He doesn't have to take it, Clara said. He just has to wait until you're too tired and too alone to make it matter. He's done it for 6 years already. How much longer are you planning to let him? The fire was the only sound in the room for a long moment. Gideon stood up. He was a tall man, and when he stood the room felt smaller, but Clara didn't step back. She waited. "What are you suggesting?" he said quietly. "I'm not suggesting anything yet," she said. "I'm asking whether the people whose barn you rebuilt, and whose doctor you paid, and whose fence you mended in the dead of winter, whether those people would say so." Out loud, to whoever needed to hear it. He looked at her for a long time. Whatever was happening behind his eyes, he wasn't giving her access to it. That was all right. She hadn't asked for access. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe. Then I think that's the question worth answering," she said. She went to bed. He stood in the main room for a long time afterward. She was fairly certain of that, because when she woke briefly in the small hours, she could still see the faint orange line of firelight under the door, and she could hear nothing moving, which was its own kind of answer. He was thinking, good, Barrett Crow came back in the first week of March. She didn't expect it. She should have, in retrospect, because men like Crow operated on a schedule of their own choosing, and the whole point of that choice was that no one else could prepare for it. He came up the valley road in a fine wagon with a driver she didn't recognize, dressed for the mountains in the way of someone who found the mountains irritating rather than beautiful. He had money on him in the particular visible way that certain men carry money not in their pockets but in the way they hold their shoulders. Gideon was in the barn when the wagon came up the road. Clara was in the yard. She saw Crow before Gideon did. Crow looked at her, and his smile appeared that same careful, professional smile from the church, the kind of smile that was really a calculation wearing a friendly face. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. He made her name sound like a condition he found interesting. "Mr. Crow," she said. He stepped down from the wagon and looked around the yard with the proprietary interest of a man who had already decided he would own something and was just waiting on the paperwork. "Beautiful place," he said. "Hard country, but beautiful." "Can I help you with something?" Clara said. "I was hoping to speak with your husband." "About what?" He looked at her. A flicker of reassessment. She'd surprised him by not stepping back. "Business," he said pleasantly. "Land business. He's not interested," she said. "I think I'd like to hear him say so himself. You've heard him say so. You came to my wedding and tried to scare him into changing his mind with a newspaper, and here you still are, which tells me he didn't." "He's not going to." Crow's smile stayed in place, but something behind it went cold. "You're a brave young woman," he said, and somehow made it sound like an accusation. "But you've only been here, what, 2 months? You don't know everything about this valley." "Or about your husband's history." "I know enough," Clara said. "Do you?" He took one slow step toward her. Not threateningly. Men like Crow didn't need to be threatening. They were careful enough for that, but deliberately. "Did you know that the reason this valley has been so isolated is that your husband made enemies? Not just me. People in town who tried to help him and got nothing for it. People who believed a newspaper that you paid for," Clara said. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. Her heart was going faster than her voice gave away. But she had learned, somewhere in these 2 months of watching Gideon hold himself together without drama or complaint, that you didn't have to feel calm to act calm. "You backed that publication," she said. "You had the article written before Mara was even in the ground. You've been at this for 6 years because there's gold in the northern ridge, and you want this land, and you thought one grieving man alone in a valley wouldn't be able to stop you." Crow didn't move. His face had gone to something more careful now, not angry, which would have been easier. Calculating, the face of a man reorganizing his approach. You're a smart woman," he said, differently this time. Not an accusation, something more wary. "Smarter than I expected, coming from a family in the position yours was in." "My family's position is not your business," she said. "Mrs. Rourke, you should go," she said. A long pause. He looked at her. She looked at him. Behind her, she heard the barn door open and Gideon's boots on the frozen ground, and she knew without turning that he had heard at least part of this, and she knew without looking that he was standing still, watching, letting her finish it. Crow looked past her at Gideon. Something passed between them, years of it, the compressed weight of a long campaign and one long refusal. Then Crow looked back at Clara, and this time when he smiled it was smaller and colder and more honest. "You should find out who your husband's real friends are," he said, "before you start making enemies on his behalf." He climbed back onto the wagon. The driver turned the horses without being told. Clara watched them go down the road. She stood there until the wagon disappeared around the tree line, and then she exhaled, and her hands, which she'd been holding very still at her sides, started to shake slightly. Just slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs and waited for it to pass. Gideon came to stand beside her. He looked out at the empty road. "He's going to come back," he said. "I know," she said. "With something worse than a newspaper. I know that, too." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him standing there, this large, contained, private man, in whom something she couldn't name had been slowly moving for weeks, like the first melt working through river ice. "I shouldn't have let you face him alone," he said. "You didn't let me," she said. "I chose to." He looked at her. She looked back. "Clara," he said, and then stopped, which was not unusual for him. But this time, the stop felt different, not like running out of willingness, but like running out of words. Like there was something he needed to say that he didn't yet have the language for. She didn't push him. She'd learned that much. "He'll go after your family," Gideon said finally. "If he thinks you're a problem." That landed hard because she knew it was true. Her father, her mother, her brother, the 7 coins on the table. "Then we need to move faster than he does," she said. "We," Gideon said. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "We," she said. He turned and went back to the barn without another word. But his shoulders, she noticed, were different from how they'd been before Crow arrived. Fractionally different, marginally more upright. Like something in the long compressed line of his back had been, after years of bearing down, very slightly not solved, not fixed, but shifted. Clara looked at the empty road one more time. She thought about Crow's warning. She thought about the doctor who'd ridden through the storm too late, and the minister who'd watched Gideon grieve, and the families whose barns and bills and fences told a story that no newspaper had ever printed. She thought, those people are out there. They know the truth. Someone just has to ask them for it. She turned and walked back inside. She sat at the table and pulled a clean sheet of paper from the drawer, and she picked up the pen, and for a long time she sat looking at the blank page. Then she started writing. The letters took her 4 days to write. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she had to say it correctly, had to find the exact tone that would not sound desperate or accusatory or naive, the tone of a woman who understood what she was asking and why it mattered. She wrote to the doctor. She wrote to Reverend Marsh. She wrote to 3 families whose names Walter had given her, and 2 more whose names she'd found in the margins of Gideon's old ledger books, where he'd recorded supplies given out without payment in the shorthand of a man who wasn't so much as keeping honest. She wrote each letter by hand at the table after Gideon had gone to bed. She did not tell him what she was doing. That was deliberate. Not deceptive, she wasn't hiding it from him the way you hide something shameful. She was protecting the plan from his refusal, which she knew would come the moment he understood the shape of it. Gideon Rourke was many things, but he was not a man who would willingly let another person walk into fire on his behalf. He would call it unnecessary. He would call it dangerous. He would find 6 reasonable arguments against it and present them in that quiet, certain voice of his, and she was not confident enough in her own resolve to argue through all 6 without losing ground. So she wrote the letters first. She sealed them. She gave them to Walter on a Thursday morning when Gideon was out checking the south pasture, and she asked Walter to ride them to town. Walter looked at the stack of envelopes in his hand. Then he looked at her. "You know about this? Not yet," she said. The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he tucked the letters into his coat. "I'll be back by Sunday," he said, and climbed onto his mule without further discussion. She went back inside and made bread and waited. Gideon found out on Friday she'd left one draft on the table by accident, not a final version, just her working notes, names, and questions she'd been sorting through. She came in from the chicken coop to find him standing at the table with the paper in his hand and a look on his face that she'd never seen before. Not anger. Exactly. Something older and more complicated than anger, a look that had grief in it, and something that might have been fear if it had been allowed to surface all the way. He set the paper down when she came in. "Walter rode to town this morning," he said. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it like one. "Yes, the letters." "Yes." He turned and looked at her. The morning light was behind him, and she couldn't read his face as well as she'd learned to, which was probably a mercy. "Clara," he said and stopped. "Before you say anything." "You don't know what you've done," he said, not loud. That was the thing about Gideon's anger. It didn't raise its voice. It went very quiet and very dense, like weather compressing before a storm. Those families, some of them have children in that town. Crow decides their problems. They're already problems, she said. They know the truth, and they've been silent about it for 4 years because you never asked them to speak. That silence hasn't protected them, Gideon. It's only protected Crow. You don't know what Crow is capable of. I stood in this yard and told him to his face that I knew he'd paid for that newspaper, she said. I have some idea. He looked at her sharply. She'd told him about the confrontation, but apparently she hadn't communicated the full degree of it until now. You said that, he said slowly, to his face. Someone had to. The silence that followed was the longest they'd had since she arrived. She could hear the wind picking up outside, and somewhere in the distance the black mare moving in her stall. She stood still and let him work through whatever he was working through, because she'd found that pushing Gideon Rourke through an emotion never got you anywhere useful. You had to wait for him to come to the other side of it on his own terms. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Quieter. The storm pressure was still in it, but something else too, something that made her pay closer attention. My father lost a legal fight to a man like Crow, he said. When I was 11, we had the right of it, we had witnesses. We had documentation. He paused. It didn't matter. Crow's kind of people don't play by the rules of evidence. They play by the rules of influence, and when you challenge them publicly, they don't fight you directly. They find the thing you care about most, and they lean on it until it breaks. Clara heard what he wasn't saying. She heard, "You are the thing I care about." Your family is the thing he'll lean on. She heard it, and it moved something in her chest that she wasn't ready to name yet, and she filed it away carefully. Then we need to move faster than his influence does, she said. It was almost the same thing she'd said to him in the yard when Crow left. He recognized it. She could see that. The letters are already sent, he said. Not accusing, just confirming the reality of it. They are. He exhaled. He turned away and stood at the window with his back to her, and she watched the line of his shoulders, the way he was carrying this, and she thought about what Walter had said lighter before, and understood that she was watching what happened to a person when they'd been heavy for too long. You got used to the weight. You built your whole posture around it. And someone trying to lift it felt, paradoxically, more frightening than the weight itself, because at least the weight was known. If this goes wrong, he said to the window, you need to be able to go home. To your family. I'll make stop, she said. He turned. Stop planning for my retreat, she said. I'm not retreating. I made a choice to be here, and I made a choice to send those letters, and I understand what both of those things cost. Don't manage me, Gideon. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I've done. He looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. All right, he said finally. It was only 2 words. But coming from him, in that voice, in that moment, it was more than she'd expected. The first response came on a Monday, 9 days after the letters went out. It arrived with Walter, who came up the valley road, looking like a man who'd been chewing on something complicated the entire ride. He handed Clara a sealed envelope and accepted coffee and sat at the table and watched her read. The letter was from Dr. Emmett Hollis, the physician who had ridden through the storm with Gideon 4 years back. He was 71 years old and practicing medicine in Red Hollow still, though his son had taken over most of the heavy work. The letter was short, handwritten in a physician's careful script, each word chosen like a man dictating a medical record. He wrote that he had wanted to speak publicly about what he'd witnessed for 4 years. That he had attempted to do so twice in the months following Clara Rourke's death, and both times had found his account met with silence or skepticism from people who had already decided on a version of events and found the true one inconvenient. He wrote that Gideon Rourke had ridden through conditions that Hollis himself would not have chosen to ride through, and had arrived at his door in a state of exhaustion and exposure that would have hospitalized most men, and had said only one thing: "My wife needs help." "How fast can you ride?" He wrote, "I will say all of this in any forum that will have me. I have been waiting to be asked." Clara read that last line twice. She set the letter down and pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment, composing herself, and Walter watched her do it and said nothing. "He'll come," she said. "He'll come," Walter said. "And he's not the only one. Harlan Briggs sent word through his wife. He's the rancher on the East Ridge. You haven't met him. Gideon rebuilt his barn 3 winters back after the fire. He says his whole family will stand up and say what they know." Clara looked at the letter again. She thought about Gideon in a storm, riding 30 miles through conditions that would have hospitalized most men, and arriving at a stranger's door saying only, "How fast can you ride?" She thought about what the newspaper had called him. The gap between those two things was so wide and so deliberate that it made her sick in a specific cold way, the way you feel sick not from sadness but from the pure recognition of calculated cruelty. "Walter," she said, "I need to go to Red Hollow." The old man set down his coffee cup. "I figured you'd come to that. I need to talk to the minister. And the doctor in person, not just by letter. And I need to look through whatever records I can find, the original newspaper, earlier editions, anything that shows when Crow started buying influence in that town." "That's a half-day ride," Walter said. "I know. In March. Roads aren't good. I know that too." Walter picked up his cup again. Studied its contents. "When do you want to go?" "Thursday," she said. "Gideon will be at the north fence all day. He doesn't need to know until after." Walter looked at her with an expression that was equal parts respect and the particular wariness of a man who had lived long enough to know that plans made behind the back of a Rourke tended to create complications. "He's going to be furious," Walter said. "He'll understand once it's done," she said. "Maybe." Walter made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'll bring the cart," he said. She told Gideon she was going to visit Walter's place to help with some mending a lie she felt bad about, and told anyway, because the alternative was an argument she didn't have time for. Gideon had accepted it with the look of a man who wasn't entirely sure he believed it, but didn't have grounds to challenge it yet. She'd ridden out before he came back from the north fence. Red Hollow was smaller than she'd remembered, or maybe it was just that Blackthorn Valley had recalibrated her sense of scale. The buildings along the main road looked temporary somehow, like things that had been set down in haste and never properly committed to. She noticed people looking at her from doorways and storefronts as Walter drove the cart up the main road, and she kept her spine straight and her hands still in her lap and looked back at them without apology. She was Gideon Rourke's wife. Whatever that had meant to this town before, she intended to change what it meant going forward. Dr. Hollis was waiting for her at his office. He was a small man, older than she'd expected, with white hair and the kind of hands that had spent a lifetime doing careful work and showed it. He stood when she came in and shook her hand firmly and said, "Mrs. Rourke, I've been hoping for this conversation for a long time." "Tell me everything," she said. He did. For 2 hours, he told her. Not just the night of the storm and the ride and the road that had been taken out by the ice. Though he told her all of that in careful detail, The kind of detail that comes from a memory that has been replaying the same events for 4 years, looking for the moment it could have gone differently. He told her about the weeks that followed, about going to the editor of the local paper with his account and being told the story was already written and already in print, about writing a letter to the paper that was never published, about speaking to Reverend Marsh, who had listened and believed him and been equally unable to get a correction printed. The editor at the time was a man named Foltz, Hollis said. He's gone now, moved east 2 years back, but he was Crow's man. Everyone in town suspected it. Nobody could prove it. Can anyone prove it now? Clara asked. Hollis hesitated. There's a woman, Ellen Foltz, his wife. She stayed when he left. She and I have spoken not directly about this, but I've always had the sense she knows more than she's said. He paused. She might talk to you. She wouldn't talk to me. Why would she talk to me? Because you're a woman who married a man people told her was dangerous, Hollis said simply. And you clearly survived the experience. She might find that persuasive. Ellen Foltz lived in a house at the south end of town that needed paint and had a garden that had been tended carefully through the winter, the kind of garden that tells you something about a person's relationship with persistence. She answered the door on the second knock and looked at Clara with an expression that was not surprised. Like she'd been expecting a visit of this nature eventually, and had just been waiting to find out who'd make it. She was 50, or near enough, with gray coming in at the temples and the eyes of a woman who had seen a great deal and processed most of it alone. You're the Rourke wife, she said. Clara Rourke, Clara said. Can I come in? Ellen Foltz stood aside. The inside of the house was neat and sparse and smelled like coffee and old paper. She poured 2 cups without being asked, and sat at her kitchen table and looked at Clara with the direct, measuring gaze of a woman who had stopped having patience for indirect conversation sometime in the past and never recovered it. My husband did what Crow paid him to do, Ellen Foltz said, before Clara had asked anything. He ran the paper, he printed what he was told to print, and he looked the other way when the story didn't match the facts, because Crow's money looked better to him than the truth did. She picked up her cup. I've known that for 4 years. I've lived with it for 4 years. Why did he leave? Clara asked. Because after a while, even men like my husband get tired of what they see in the mirror, Ellen said flatly. Or they get frightened of it. In his case, I suspect it was more the second than the first, but the result was the same. Did he leave any documentation? Anything showing the connection between him and Crow? Ellen was quiet for a moment. She looked at her cup. Clara waited, which she'd gotten better at. There are letters, Ellen Foltz said. In a box in the back room. I've kept them because I didn't know what to do with them, and I didn't trust anyone in this town to do the right thing with them either. She paused. My husband doesn't know I kept them. He thought he burned everything. Clara looked at her steadily. Would you be willing to share them? Ellen met her eyes. Are you actually going to do something with them, or are you going to carry them home and put them in a locked box and wait to see which way the wind blows? The directness of it startled Clara, and then didn't, because she'd been exactly like that once, before the world had taught her to temper it. I'm going to take them to the people who can do the most damage with them, Clara said. In the most public way available to me. Ellen Foltz looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to the back room. She returned with a wooden box, plain and unremarkable, and set it on the table between them. 6 years of correspondence, Ellen said. Names, amounts, instructions. Every letter Crow sent telling my husband what to print and what to kill and how to frame it. She sat back down. I want it known when this is over that I kept these. Not him. I'll make sure of that, Clara said. Ellen pushed the box toward her. Reverend Marsh was her last stop in the late afternoon when the light had turned that particular low winter gold that made even a tired town look momentarily forgivable. He received her in the church vestibule, which she suspected was his way of reminding both of them that whatever happened here was being conducted according to his own sense of gravity. He was an older man, precise in his movements, with the particular quality of someone who had been tasked his entire life with choosing words carefully in front of people who needed them. He shook her hand and gestured toward a pew and sat across from her with his hands folded and waited for her to speak. She told him what she'd done. The letters, Hollis, Ellen Foltz, the box of correspondence. She told him what she was planning. He listened without interrupting, which she respected. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know that what you're proposing will not be comfortable for this town." "No," she said, "it won't. There are people who have built their understanding of Gideon Rourke's character around a story that turns out to be false. When you tell them that, some of them will be grateful. And some of them will be angry, because people do not like to find out they were wrong." "I know," she said, "and Crow has allies here. Not many left, but some. There may be retaliation. There will be retaliation," Clara said. "There's already been retaliation. He's been retaliating against Gideon for 6 years. The question is whether the truth is worth the cost of telling it." The minister looked at her with something she identified slowly as a form of relief, the relief of a man who had waited a long time for someone to come in and say exactly that. "I witnessed his grief," Marsh said quietly, "when Mara died and then when Lucy went. I sat with him for 2 days in that cabin. What I saw in that man was not the cruelty or the coldness they wrote about. It was he stopped, pressed his lips together. It was the kind of pain that makes a person very quiet, Mrs. Rourke, the kind that doesn't perform itself. I have always believed that his silence was taken for guilt when it was nothing more than a man too devastated to speak." "Would you say that?" Clara asked. "Publicly, in front of this community." He looked down at his folded hands. "I should have said it 4 years ago," he said. I was more cautious than I should have been. Crow's influence in this town at that time," he stopped again. She could see him weighing something, the particular weight of retrospective regret versus present courage. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I will say it." She was back in Blackthorn Valley before dark, which was luck and Walter's good judgment about the road. She came in through the cabin door to find Gideon sitting at the table in the lamplight, and from the expression on his face contained, braced, slightly white around the jaw, she understood that the mending story had not held. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine, Clara, sit down." She sat. He looked at her. He looked at the box she'd set on the table. He looked at her again. "Walter's place," he said flatly. "I'm sorry I lied about where I was going," she said. "I'm not sorry about going, Red Hollow," he said. "Yes, you rode to Red Hollow, by your Walter, and spoke to people about me, about my family, about what happened." "Yes," she said. The muscle in his jaw tightened. She could see him working through something in that particular internal way he had, where the whole process happened behind his eyes and only the result showed on his face. She waited. "Who did you speak to?" he said. "Dr. Hollis." "Reverend Marsh." She paused. "And Ellen Foltz." Something shifted in his expression. "The editor's wife. She kept the letters," Clara said. She pushed the box toward him. 6 years of correspondence between Crow and her husband. Names, amounts, specific instructions about what to print. He didn't touch the box right away. He looked at it the way you look at something you've been waiting for long enough that its actual arrival stops feeling real. "Clara," he said. His voice had dropped. "What are you planning to do with all of this?" She'd been thinking about the answer since she left Red Hollow. She'd been thinking about Hollis, who had carried 4 years of wanting to speak. She'd been thinking about Ellen Foltz and her box of letters, and her spine-straight refusal to let her husband take all the evidence with him when he left. She'd been thinking about Marsh and his hands and his quiet, "I should have said it 4 years ago." All these people telling the truth in small rooms, to each other, to themselves, in letters no one ever published. All this truth circling quietly without finding a way to land. It needed somewhere to land. "There's a town meeting," she said. "First Sunday of April," Walter told me. "The whole community comes. It's been tradition for 30 years. They go over shared concerns, seasonal business. Everyone comes. Gideon was very still. I want to speak at it, she said. No, he said immediately. Gideon, Clara, no, he stood up. Not violently, not dramatically, he just needed to be on his feet for this. You don't understand what's standing up in front of that town and making accusations against a man like Crow will. I'm not making accusations, she said. I'm presenting documentation. There's a difference. Accusations are what he did to you. What I have is evidence. He looked at her. She could see it in him, the old habit of accepting isolation as the only dignified option, the long-practiced restraint of a man who had decided that asking for anything was just inviting further loss. She understood it. She understood it more than she could have explained, because she'd watched it operating in him for 3 months now, and she'd traced it all the way back to its source, which was not selfishness or pride, but the specific damage that gets done when a person has tried to speak and been ignored enough times that the words stop coming. They won't listen, he said. The flatness in his voice, the exhausted certainty of it, was the hardest thing she'd heard him say yet. Maybe not all of them, she said, but some of them will. And some is more than none, which is what you have right now. He turned away from her. He stood at the window with his back to her again. This man who had made his back into a wall for so long he'd probably forgotten it had been something else once. You could lose everything over this, he said. Not just here. Your family if Crow goes after them. My family doesn't have anything left to lose, she said, and she hated how true that was. He can't take what they don't have, but you have something worth protecting, Gideon. This land, those graves, the life you've built here. And you can't protect it alone anymore. You've tried that for 4 years, and all it's done is make you smaller. Made the valley quieter. Given him more time, he didn't answer. He's going to come back, she said. We both know that. He's going to come back with something worse than a newspaper and worse than an offer. And when he does, you need this community behind you, or he will find a way, legal or not, to take what he wants. She paused. The letters in that box are the only thing standing between his version of events and the truth. If we don't use them, he wins by patience, the way he planned to from the beginning. Fire in the stove was burning down. The lamp cast long shadows. Outside, the wind had picked up, the kind of wind that carried the smell of coming weather. Gideon didn't move for a long time. When he finally turned from the window, his face had the look of a man who has just lost an argument with himself, not defeated, exactly, but done resisting. I won't go with you, he said to the meeting. I'm not asking you to. If you stand up in front of that town and I'm not there. I know what that looks like, she said. I've thought about it. But if you're there, they'll focus on you, and some of them will be angry, and the anger will swallow the evidence. If I go alone, they have to hear a woman who has no stake in it except the truth. You have every stake in it, he said. They don't know that yet, she said. By the time they do, it'll be too late for it to matter. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, complex, layered. Something in it that had started as the argument and become, in the last few minutes, something else entirely. She'd noticed him looking at her that way increasingly over these past weeks. Like he was continuously revising some calculation and never quite arriving at a final number. You're going to do this regardless of what I say, he said. Yes, she said. I am. A pause. Then you should take the letters, he said. All of them, and Hollis should come in person. Don't just read his account, bring him there. I already asked him, she said. He'll come. Something that was almost, not quite, possibly, the beginning of something like relief moved across Gideon's face. He pressed it back down, but she'd seen it. You thought of everything, he said, and she couldn't tell whether it was accusation or something warmer. I thought of most things, she said honestly. I'm sure I've missed something. I usually do. He picked up the wooden box. He opened it and looked at the letters inside the careful stacks of them, the years of damage, all of it documented in Crow's own handwriting. He closed it again. He set it on the shelf above the table where she'd put Lucy's carved bird, and the coincidence of that placement made her breath catch in her throat for a moment. "Clara," he said. His voice was different again. She'd cataloged so many versions of his voice, by now the careful version, the closed version, the one that went dense before a storm. This was none of those. This was something slower and more uncertain, the voice of a man navigating ground he hadn't been on in a long time. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. For once, he didn't look away first. He just looked at her, this man who had survived grief and isolation and deliberate cruelty and had come out the other side of all of it not hardened exactly, but compressed into something denser and more careful than he'd been before. "Can't ask you to do this," he said. "You didn't ask," she said. "I decided." He exhaled. "Set down the box if something goes wrong." "Then something goes wrong," she said, "and we figure out what's next from there." He nodded slowly. It was not agreement so much as it was the absence of further argument, which, from Gideon Rourke, she had come to understand was its own form of trust. She spent the next 2 weeks preparing. She organized the letters by date, by content, by the specificity of each instruction, what to print, what to suppress, how much had changed hands for which story. She wrote out a summary in her own hand that anyone could follow, even someone who hadn't been following the story for 6 years. She met twice more with Walter, who proved to have a detailed and unexpectedly lawyerly mind for the arrangement of evidence, and who helped her see 3 gaps in her account that she then went back and filled. She wrote to Hollis again confirming the date. He wrote back the same week, "I will be there." "I have waited long enough." She went over it in her head every night before sleep what she would say, in what order, where the difficult moments would come, how she would hold her ground when Crow's remaining allies in that room began to push back. Because they would. She had no illusions about that. She also spent those 2 weeks being something she hadn't entirely been before, present. Not planning, not preparing, just present in the life that had been assembling itself around her in Blackthorn Valley since January. She cooked supper and sat across from Gideon and talked to him about small things, about the mare's shoulder, about the fence, about a letter from her brother that had arrived saying he was well, and that the roof had been repaired, which meant the money Gideon had arranged for her family had reached them, a fact she hadn't known until now. She looked up from the letter. "You sent them money," she said. Gideon looked at the table. "I told your father I would provide for his family," he said. "That's what I meant. You didn't tell me," she said. "It wasn't I didn't." He stopped, started again. It's not something that needed to be said. She looked at him for a long moment. He was uncomfortable with her, looking at him this way. She could see that. He had a particular way of going slightly rigid when someone was seeing him clearly. "Thank you," she said. "It's not Gideon. Thank you." He looked at her. Then he nodded, once, and looked back at his supper, and she turned back to her brother's letter, and the fire crackled, and the valley outside was quiet and cold and entirely theirs. The night before she rode to Red Hollowed Hollow for the meeting, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and went through it all again. All the pieces, all the faces she'd encountered, all the ways it could go wrong. She thought about standing in front of a community that had watched her walk to Gideon's wagon in a wedding dress and had felt, she suspected, a combination of pity and relief that it hadn't been their daughter. She thought about making them feel something different. She thought about Lucy Rourke, 4 years old, who had called every bird she ever saw the flying ones, like it was the most remarkable thing in the world that something could just leave the ground like that. She got up just before dawn. She dressed. She went to the main room. Gideon was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, which meant he'd been up longer than her, which meant he also hadn't slept. He looked at her when she came in, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. She sat down across from him. He pushed the second cup toward her, already poured, already waiting, because he had known she'd come out eventually. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I'm going to tell them the truth," she said. All of it. I'm going to tell them about the storm and the ride and the road that was gone and the doctor who was too late. I'm going to show them the letters. I'm going to tell them about the families you helped and about Crow and about every year of this that he planned and they never questioned. Gideon looked at his cup. They might not believe you. Some of them won't, she said. That's all right. Clara, he looked up. Whatever happens, I want you to know that what you've... He stopped. Cleared his throat. Tried again. Nobody has ever... He stopped again, shorter this time, like the sentence kept finding an edge he hadn't expected. She waited. Nobody, he said finally, very quietly, has ever done anything like this for me. She looked at him. She thought about what to say, and then decided not to say anything, because he hadn't said it to get a response. He'd said it because it was true, and it had needed to be said finally. After all this time, out loud in a room that could hold it. She drank her coffee. The sun came up over the ridge, slow and gray and real, and lit the valley one cold inch at a time. And in an hour she would ride down the mountain road toward Red Hollow with a box of letters and 4 years of truth, and she didn't know exactly what would happen when she got there. But she knew she would not turn back. The road down from Blackthorn Valley was longer in the mind than it was in miles. Clara had ridden it twice now, once coming up in January, sitting beside Gideon on the wagon bench with his coat around her shoulders and a folded newspaper in her bag that she hadn't yet read all the way through. And once going down to Red Hollow with Walter. In March, when she'd gone to see Hollis and Marsh and Ellen Foltz and come back with a box of letters that were going to change things, one way or another. She knew this road now. She knew where it narrowed past the pine stand, where the creek crossing ran shallow enough to ford without trouble, where the switchback at the lower ridge required you to give the horse its head and trust its footing. She knew it, and still this morning it felt like different terrain entirely. Walter drove. She sat beside him in the cart with the wooden box on her lap and her hands flat on top of it, not gripping, just resting. She'd made a decision some time before dawn that she was not going to hold this morning tightly. Tight hands made for a tense horse and a tense speaker and a tense room, and she needed none of those things. "You sleep at all?" Walter asked, about 20 minutes into the ride. "Some," she said, which was not entirely false. "Eat anything." "Coffee." He made a disapproving sound that was entirely in keeping with his general approach to people who didn't take adequate care of themselves, and reached behind the bench and handed her a cloth-wrapped piece of cornbread without looking at her. She took it and ate it because arguing with Walter before 8 in the morning was a battle she'd learned not to pick. The sky was the pale, tentative blue of early April, the kind of sky that hadn't yet committed to the day's weather. Snow still held on the north-facing slopes, but the road itself was mostly clear, churned to mud in the low spots and firm to hardpack on the rises. They made good time. She thought about what she was going to say. She'd written it out and crossed it out and written it again, and finally, 3 nights ago, put the paper away and stopped trying to memorize anything. What she knew, she knew. What she'd seen with her own eyes and read with her own hands and understood through 3 months of living in a valley that grief had made very quiet that didn't need to be rehearsed. It just needed to be said. It was the saying it that was hard. Red Hollow's meeting hall was a wide, low building on the north end of the main road, wood-framed, with a pitched roof that collected snow badly, and a floor that creaked in several places with a specific and consistent geography that the locals had learned to navigate unconsciously. Clara had never been inside it before. She walked in behind Walter at 9:90 before the meeting was scheduled to start, and stood for a moment in the empty space and let herself feel the size of it. Long benches, a raised platform at the front with a simple podium. 2 cast-iron stoves, one on each side wall, already going. Windows along the east side that let in the morning light at a low, slanting angle that would be in the eyes of anyone sitting in the front third of the room. Hollis was already there, sitting near the front with his coat folded on the bench beside him. He stood when Clara came in and shook her hand again, that firm, unhurried handshake, and introduced her to a woman she hadn't met yet. Martha Briggs, Harlan Briggs's wife from the East Ridge. She was a rangy, sun-weathered woman in her late 40s with intelligent eyes and the settled posture of someone who had made up her mind about something long ago and simply been waiting for the opportunity to act on it. "My husband and our 2 eldest are coming," Martha Briggs said. "They'll be here by 10. Harlan wrote down what he wants to say. I told him to speak from his head instead, but he's a man who needs things written to feel comfortable, so." "Whatever he's comfortable with," Clara said. "He rebuilt the whole west wall of that barn himself," Martha said. "Harlan's not a man who asks for help. Having Gideon show up that morning, Harlan's been carrying that for 3 years and never said a word in public because nobody asked." She paused. "People should have asked." "They should have," Clara agreed. Reverend Marsh arrived at 10, precise as always in his good coat. He found Clara near the front and sat beside her for a moment and said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens today, I believe you are doing the right thing. I'm not always certain of things, but I'm certain of that." "Thank you," she said. "I've spoken to 3 other families since your letter came," he said. "People who had their own reasons to speak but never found the moment. 2 of them are coming today. I don't know if they'll stand up. I can't promise they will, but they'll be here." Clara looked at him. "That's more than I expected." "Truth has a way of finding allies once it starts moving," he said. "The problem is getting it moving in the first place." The room filled faster than she'd anticipated. By 10:30, most of the benches were occupied, and people were still coming in from the road. She recognized some faces, the women who'd been at the wedding, the merchants along the main street who'd watched her ride past with Walter in March. Some of them met her eyes. Most didn't. She saw Crow's man first. She didn't know his name, but she recognized the type, a well-dressed man in his 30s, sitting near the back, with the particular stillness of someone who had been sent to observe and report. Crow himself arrived at 11:15, and the room shifted in the way rooms do when someone with money and authority enters, not dramatically, just a subtle redistribution of attention. People straightening slightly, conversations pausing. He found a seat near the aisle, 3rd row from the front, and he looked at Clara with an expression of complete and practiced neutrality. He had not expected her to be here. She could see that in the fractional delay before his face settled into that neutral mask. He'd expected what? That the letters would be used privately, quietly, in some form he could challenge or suppress before they reached daylight. He recovered quickly. She gave him that. The mask went up in less than 2 seconds, and he sat with his hands folded and his eyes forward, and gave every appearance of a man who had come to attend a routine community meeting and was mildly surprised to find it better attended than usual. Clara turned back to the front. Her heart was going hard now, solid and fast, and she let it. She wasn't going to pretend she wasn't afraid. Being afraid and doing the thing anyway was just what this was. The meeting opened with routine business, seasonal road repair, a dispute over water rights on the creek south of town, a report on the condition of the schoolhouse roof. Clara sat through all of it with her hands in her lap and the wooden box on the bench beside her. Walter sat on her other side, solid and immovable as an old fence post. Occasionally making the sound in the back of his throat that she'd come to understand meant he found something mildly stupid, but wasn't going to say so. The moderator, a barrel-chested man named Aldous Webb, who ran the grain store and apparently had been running these meetings for 15 years, was working through the agenda with efficient boredom when Clara stood up. She stood up before he called for additional business. She stood up into a moment of conversation and movement and room noise, and the sheer unexpectedness of it created a brief, spreading silence that moved outward from her like a stone dropped in water. Webb looked at her. "Ma'am, if you'll wait for the mic." "My name is Clara Rourke," she said, and her voice carried better than she'd expected, which was a relief. "I'm Gideon Rourke's wife. I've come from Blackthorn Valley, and I have something this community needs to hear." Webb blinked. "Mrs. Rourke will have a general comments period after the mites." "I understand," she said. I'm asking for the room's indulgence. What I have to say is directly relevant to a business matter that several people in this room have a stake in. And it cannot wait for a comments period because it concerns evidence that will lose its impact once it's been circulated to the interested parties first. She looked at Crow when she said interested parties. Just for a moment, just long enough, a low murmur moved through the room. Webb looked around at the benches, reading the room with the practiced eye of a man who'd been doing this long enough to know when a crowd was curious enough to override procedure. He found enough of both in the faces in front of him. 5 minutes, he said, not happily. Thank you, she said. She picked up the box. She set it on the podium. She opened it, and she looked out at the room at the faces she knew and the ones she didn't, at the women who'd been at her wedding and the ranchers who'd never met her, at Marsh in the 4th row and Hollis in the 2nd, and Martha Briggs with her husband and sons taking up most of one bench, and she started to speak. She didn't start with Crow. That was the first decision she'd made and held to, against her instinct, which had wanted to lead with the letters, because the letters were the most dramatic thing in the box. But drama wasn't the point. Truth was the point, and truth needed context before it needed dramatics. She started with the storm. She told it the way Hollis had told her plainly, with detail, with the specific texture of a night so cold and a road so destroyed that it wasn't a story about failure. It was a story about the specific cruelty of weather and timing and bad luck. She told them about Gideon riding 30 miles through conditions that Hollis himself, who had lived in this region his entire life, had called the worst he'd seen. She told them about the bridge that had been taken out by ice and the 6-mile detour and arriving back in the valley at dawn to find that they were already too late. She didn't editorialize. She didn't ask the room to feel anything specific. She just laid it down fact by fact, the way you lay stones for a foundation. When she paused, Hollis stood up. He didn't need to be prompted. He simply stood, and the room turned toward him with the particular attention that a 71-year-old physician commands without effort. And he said, "I was there. Every word Mrs. Rourke has told you is accurate. I have wanted to say so publicly for 4 years. I should have said so sooner, and the fact that I didn't is something I have to live with." He paused. Gideon Rourke did not cause his wife's death. He rode through a storm that nearly killed him trying to prevent it. That is the truth, and I am prepared to swear to it in any formal setting this community requires. He sat down. The room was very quiet. Clara let the quiet hold for a moment. Then she turned to the box. "I want to show you something," she said. She lifted the first letter. She read the date 4 years ago. Early winter, before the storm, before the article. She read the salutation. She read the body of the letter, which instructed the editor of the local paper, in language that was careful but unmistakable, to prepare a story about a valley rancher whose reputation, as the letter put it, was in need of correction for the benefit of regional investment interests. Up. "This letter is signed with initials," she said. "BC," she paused. "Barrett Crow." The room moved. Not a single motion, a collective shift. The sound of people adjusting in their seats and turning to look at each other and then turning back to her. Crow, from his seat in the 3rd row, said in a composed and carrying voice, "That's a serious allegation, Mrs. Rourke. I'd be interested to know the source of a document like that." "The source," Clara said, "is the wife of the editor who received it, who kept it along with 23 other letters covering a period of 6 years, because she understood that the day would come when someone would need them." She pulled the stack from the box and held it up. "All of these letters are in Crow's handwriting, on his personal stationery, and most of them contain specific dollar amounts paid to the paper for specific stories. The amounts are consistent with figures in the paper's own financial records, which Ellen Foltz also kept." The room was louder now. Not shouting, but the kind of layered conversation that happens when a crowd is processing something faster than it can organize its responses. Clara held the stack of letters and waited. Crow stood up. He was good at this. She had to concede that. He stood with exactly the right degree of calm outrage, the posture of a man who was being wronged publicly, and knew how to make that visible without losing his composure. "I want to be clear," he said to the room, not to Clara. To the room, which was the right instinct, that I have invested significantly in this community over many years. I have bought land fairly, paid my obligations fairly, and I will not stand in this hall and be accused of criminal conduct by a young woman who has been in this valley for 3 months, and whose understanding of its history is, at best, incomplete. Your land investments are not the question, Clara said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, which was the thing she'd been most afraid of, and which turned out, when she needed it, to be all right. The question is whether you paid to have false stories printed about a man in order to isolate him from this community and make him more willing to sell land that sits over a gold deposit you've known about for 6 years. The room went very quiet again, a different kind of quiet this time. She heard someone say a man's voice, from somewhere in the middle of the room. "Gold? There is a significant gold deposit under the northern ridge of Blackthorn Valley," Clara said. "Walter Fenwick can speak to the geological surveys that confirmed it. Gideon Rourke has been aware of it for some time. Barrett Crow has been aware of it since before the newspaper article was published." Harlan Briggs stood up from his bench without ceremony. He was a large, sun-darkened man with the slow-moving confidence of someone who had worked hard land long enough to stop being impressed by most things. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand, the written statement his wife had mentioned. "I'm Harlan Briggs," he said to the room, though most of the room knew who he was. "4 winters back, I lost my barn to a fire in February. March, in a week when we didn't have anything to spare and 2 of my kids were sick. Gideon Rourke showed up on a Tuesday morning with lumber I hadn't asked for and 2 extra hands I also hadn't asked for, and spent 4 days rebuilding the west wall. He didn't ask for payment. He didn't ask for anything. He came back in April and finished the roof." Briggs paused, looking down at his paper, then looked up again without reading from it. "I didn't stand up and say that when people were saying things about him. I should have. The fact that he'd helped me and I stayed quiet while people said things about him, I'm not proud of that." He sat down. Martha Briggs reached over and put her hand on his forearm, and he looked at it, and some of the set went out of his jaw. 2 rows back, a woman Clara didn't know stood up. 50-ish, careful in her movements, the posture of someone unaccustomed to speaking in public. She said her name was Ruth Calloway, that her husband had passed 3 years ago, and that in the winter after his death, when she'd been unable to manage the feed costs for her livestock, she had come home one morning to find 3 months' worth of feed stacked in her barn with no note and no indication of who had left it. She said she had asked around quietly and been told, eventually, by one of the hands who'd helped unload the wagon, that it had come from Blackthorn Valley. She said, "I never thanked him. I didn't know how. He'd done it so I wouldn't have to thank him, I think. But I knew what the town was saying about him, and I didn't speak up, and this is me speaking up." She sat down. Clara stood at the podium and watched the room move, watched the slow, tidal change of a crowd that has been given information it can't unlearn and is in the process of deciding what to do with it. It wasn't clean. It wasn't uniform. There were people in that room who were going to be angry about having been wrong, and she could see them sitting with their arms crossed and their chins set. There were people who looked confused, like they were trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same story and finding that only one of them had actual evidence behind it. And there were people more than she'd expected, sitting in scattered places around the room who looked, slowly and carefully, like relief. Like people who had known something was wrong for a long time and had just been given permission to say so. Crow tried twice more. He was disciplined about it. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't make the mistake of directing his anger at Clara personally in a room full of people who were watching for exactly that. He challenged the provenance of the letters, questioned the reliability of Hollis's memory after 4 years, suggested that the geological survey Walter had conducted was informal, and subject to interpretation. Each time, Clara answered him with the particular patience of someone who had spent the previous 2 weeks preparing for exactly this and had found, on examination, that the evidence was solid enough to hold. The third time Crow stood to respond, the moderator Webb held up a hand. "Mr. Crow," Webb said slowly, "I think the room has heard your position." He paused, in the way of a man who is choosing his next words carefully because he understands they will be repeated. "And I think the room has heard enough of everything to have questions of its own that don't require your help to answer." It was not a dramatic statement. It was not heroic. It was a moderator who ran the grain store and had been running community meetings for 15 years, saying in the plainest possible terms that he was no longer managing the conversation in Crow's favor. Crow looked at Webb for a moment. He looked at the room. He looked at Clara, and in that look brief, contained, behind the professional mask, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to the cold recognition of a man who has just watched a long game end in a way he'd failed to account for. He picked up his hat from the bench beside him. He stood. He walked to the aisle with the measured, upright gait of someone who was not going to give the room the satisfaction of seeing him hurry, and he went to the door, and he opened it, and he left. Nobody stopped him. Nobody followed him. The door closed behind him, and for a moment the room simply breathed. Then someone in the back started talking, and someone in the middle answered, and the wave of conversation that had been held at the dam all morning came through at once, and Clara stood at the podium and let it come. She didn't get back to Blackthorn Valley until nearly dusk. The meeting had run long, not chaotically, but long in the way of a room that has a lot of recalibrating to do and has decided to do some of it out loud, together, rather than carry it home to do privately. People had come up to her afterward. Some of them she'd expected, Hollis shaking her hand again, Martha Briggs hugging her with the practical efficiency of someone who had decided a hug was the appropriate response and was going to deliver it regardless of whether it was comfortable. Some she hadn't expected, an older man who introduced himself as a former alderman and said he'd suspected something was wrong with the newspaper account for years but hadn't trusted his suspicion enough to act on it. A young woman, maybe Clara's own age, who said only that she remembered Gideon's wife, Mara, and that Mara had been kind to her when she was small, and that she was glad the truth had come out. That one she'd had to hold together for. Webb had caught her near the door as she was leaving and said, in his plain-spoken way, "We'll be looking at those letters more formally. I don't know exactly what that means yet, but we'll be doing it. The originals are in the box," she said. "I made copies." He looked at her with the expression of someone who is revising their assessment of a situation upward. "Good thinking," he said. She rode back with Walter in the last of the afternoon light, the cart moving through the lower valley while the shadows stretched long and the temperature began to drop. Walter drove without talking, which was one of his best qualities. She sat beside him and let the day settle through her the weight of it, the strange deflating feeling of having done the thing you built yourself up to do and now finding yourself simply tired on the other side. "You did well," Walter said, somewhere past the pine stand. "I was terrified the entire time," she said. "I know." "Still did well." She looked at the road ahead of them. "Do you think it'll hold? What happened today?" Walter thought about it with his characteristic seriousness. "Some of it," he said. "Not all of it. Crow's not finished men like that don't finish until they run out of money or options, and he's not out of either yet. But today cost him something he can't get back. The room," she said. "The room," Walter agreed. He had this community half convinced for 6 years. Whatever he tries next, he's going to have to try it in a town that saw what they saw today. That's a different thing entirely. She sat with that as they climbed the switchback at the lower ridge, the horse working steadily up the grade, the air cooling around them fast as the sun got low. Gideon was in the yard when the cart came up the road. He hadn't been in the yard, incidentally he'd been waiting. She could see that, though he was making a reasonable effort to look like he'd simply happened to be there. He was standing near the fence with no particular task in his hands, which was unusual enough to be significant. He looked at her as Walter stopped the cart. She climbed down, and her legs were stiffer than she'd realized from sitting all day, and she stood for a moment in the yard while the evening settled around them. "Well," he said. Just that, she looked at him. She thought about everything she could tell him the room. Hollis, Martha Briggs, Ruth Calloway and her feed, Webb's face when Crow walked out the door. She thought about how to summarize 6 hours of the most difficult things she'd done into something that fit in the space between them on a cold April evening. Crow left before it was over, she said. Something moved across Gideon's face. He was still holding the controlled expression, the set jaw, the careful distance he maintained between what he felt and what he showed, but beneath it something had shifted. She could see it the same way she could see the thaw working through the creek ice in March, not by watching the surface directly, but by the way the sound changed. "Did you say what you needed to say?" he asked. "Everything," she said. Hollis, Marsh, Harlan Briggs, 2 other families. The letters. He was quiet for a long moment. "How did the room take it?" "Unevenly," she said honestly. Some people were angry. Some were relieved. A lot of them were just adjusting. She paused. "Webb said they'll look at the letters formally. I left the originals." He nodded slowly. Walter made the particular sound that indicated he was about to excuse himself tactfully, which for Walter meant climbing down from the cart without ceremony and beginning to unhitch the horse with focused attention, as if the conversation happening 3 feet away was inaudible to him. Clara and Gideon stood in the yard, and the space between them had the particular quality it had been developing over weeks, not empty anymore, not the formal distance of strangers, but not yet the easy closeness of people who had said all the things they needed to say. "I owe you an apology," Gideon said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For the arguments I made against doing this," he said. "For making it harder than it had to be." "You made reasonable arguments," she said. "I made arguments that were reasonable on the surface and were actually—" He stopped. Started again. "I was afraid," he said. And the plainness of it, the difficulty of it, the way it landed in his voice, she understood what it cost him. "Not for myself. I stopped being afraid for myself a long time ago. I was afraid that if this went wrong, it would land on you. And I didn't know how to live with that." She looked at him in the fading light. "I know," she said. "You shouldn't have had to do it alone. Walter was with me. You know what I mean." She did know. She'd known it going down the mountain this morning, and she'd made peace with it. And she wasn't going to make him pay for the same admission twice. "It's done," she said, and it went as well as it could have. "And we'll deal with whatever comes next when it comes." He looked at her, and for a moment the controlled expression was simply gone. Not replaced by something dramatic, not replaced by a breakdown or a declaration. It was more like a man who had been holding a particular shape for a very long time and had finally let the muscles go, just briefly, just enough to feel the difference between the holding and the rest. "Come inside," he said. "I made supper." She almost smiled. Of course he had. He'd spent the day waiting and not knowing, and so he'd done the thing he knew how to do, which was work, which was provide, which was make sure that when she came home, there would be something warm waiting. She followed him in. The days that followed were not the clean resolution she'd half allowed herself to imagine during the drive back. Truth, she was learning, didn't work that way. It landed, and then it kept landing, in aftershocks and complications, and people having to revise things they'd believed for long enough that the revision felt like loss, which made some of them resistant in ways she hadn't fully planned for. 3 days after the meeting, she received a letter from a man she didn't know, a rancher from the south end of the region, affiliated with Crow's investment network, that was politely worded and contained a thinly veiled suggestion that she had made allegations she couldn't support and that there were legal avenues available to those who'd been defamed in a public setting. She read it twice. Then she gave it to Gideon. he read it. Set it down. His lawyers are faster than his pride, he said. Is this a problem? Possibly said. Probably not. The letters are the answer to everything he can legally challenge, and he knows Ellen Foltz has them. He's feeling us out. What do nothing, he said. We wait, and we don't write back. She thought about it. It's very unlike my usual approach. I know, he said, and something in his voice had a quality she was still getting used to, not quite warmth, but adjacent to it, a kind of dry recognition that said he had been paying attention to who she was and had opinions about it. She didn't write back. The letter was not followed by another. What was followed was something she hadn't anticipated, because it came not as opposition but as the opposite. 6 days after the meeting, a wagon came up the road from Red Hollow. It was the Briggs family, Harlan and Martha, and their 2 eldest. Bringing lumber, they said they'd been meaning to get up here for a couple of years. Nothing specific, just lumber. Gideon stood in the yard and looked at the wagon and said, I didn't ask for this. I know you didn't, Harlan Briggs said, climbing down. That's not the point. There was a long pause. Then Gideon said, There's a section of the south fence needs posts. Show me, Harlan said. They worked for 2 days. Clara cooked for all of them and listened to the conversation that happened between working men who had gotten past the awkward part and arrived at the practical part, which was the part Gideon was most comfortable in. She watched him and Harlan Briggs work side by side with the economy of men who understood land and weather and what things needed doing, and she thought that this right here was what isolation had taken from him. Not dramatic connection, not deep feeling, just this. Other people, working. Reverend Marsh came the week after. He didn't bring lumber. He brought 2 of the families he'd mentioned, the ones he'd thought might not stand up at the meeting, but had been there. They came in 2 wagons, 7 people total, and they stayed for an afternoon. Most of it was not about the meeting or Crow or the past. Most of it was the awkward, effortful business of people who have been told they were wrong about someone and are now in the actual presence of that someone, figuring out how to rearrange themselves. It wasn't graceful. One of the men said something that Clara could see landed badly on Gideon, a clumsy attempt at apology that came out more like an explanation of why he'd believed the wrong thing, which was different, and Gideon went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, and Clara watched him choose not to answer and understood that this was its own form of grace, to let a man's bad apology stand without correcting it. Later, when the wagons had gone, she asked him if he was all right. People are not good at apologies, he said. No, she said. That one wanted credit for believing the paper, he said. Like being deceived made him the victim. Some people need to be the victim, she said. It's the only position they know how to occupy. He looked at her. That's unkind. It's true, she said. A pause. Yes, he admitted. It's both. The news about Crow came through Walter, as most news did. It came in 2 pieces on 2 different days, which gave it the quality of a slow collapse rather than a single event. The first piece, 3 of the investors Crow had assembled around the Blackthorn Valley project had withdrawn. Not loudly, not publicly. Men with money rarely made public declarations about their failures, but Walter had contacts at the bank in the county seat. And the word was that the letter of credit Crow had been using to leverage his offer had been recalled. Without that backing, the offer itself was paper. He can't buy the valley, Walter said, sitting at Clara's table with his coffee. Doesn't have the capital without his investors, and his investors have decided the risk isn't worth it. What changed their minds? Clara asked. Publicity, Walter said. Rich men don't like being associated with a story that's starting to travel. The meeting, the letters, people talk. It's gotten to the county paper. Next step, it's someone else's problem. The second piece came 4 days later. Crow was leaving Red Hollow. His office on the main road was being cleared out. His man of business had been seen loading files into a wagon. No announcement, no explanation to the town. He was simply beginning the process of being somewhere else. Clara was in the yard when Walter told her, and she stood for a moment and let the information settle. The way you let something settle when you've been braced for a fight that has just, without ceremony, decided not to happen. She thought she would feel something larger. Relief, maybe. Triumph. What she actually felt was quiet, a particular kind of quiet that came not from emptiness but from the absence of pressure. Like setting down something you'd been carrying long enough that you'd stopped noticing the weight. "It's not over," Walter said. "He still has the letter from his lawyers." "He could still—" "I know," she said, "but he's leaving." Walter nodded. "He's leaving." She looked at the tree line, at the shape of the cottonwood visible through the pines in the distance. She thought about 2 stones in the snow, and a man who had cleared them in winter, who had carved birds in the evenings, who had given a stranger his coat on a cold mountain road and his bedroom on the first night, and his silence as a form of respect she hadn't understood until much later. She thought, he keeps this land. The graves stay. The gold doesn't give Crow anything anymore. It wasn't a perfect outcome. The families who had believed the wrong thing for 4 years would not all revise themselves overnight, and some of them would find reasons not to revise at all. Crow leaving didn't erase the years, didn't bring back what the isolation had cost. Gideon was not suddenly a different man than he'd been. He was still careful, still quiet, still the kind of person who expressed most things through action rather than words. None of the actual architecture of what had happened to him was gone. But something had changed. She could feel it in the valley the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives, not in a single dramatic gust, but in the quality of the air itself, in the way the light fell differently. She went inside to tell Gideon. He was at the table, working on a piece of leather tack that had been needing repair for a month. He looked up when she came in, and before she said anything, he read something in her face that answered most of his questions. "Walter brought news," she said. "Crow, he's leaving." Gideon looked at the leather in his hands. He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him and did not try to name what was moving through him, because she had learned by now that some things in him moved too slowly to be named in real time. You had to wait for them to surface. "The graves will stay," he said finally. "Yes," she said. He set down the leather. He looked at the window. Outside, the valley was doing what it had been doing all spring, which was slowly and imperfectly becoming itself again, the snow retreating up the slopes, the creek running high, the pasture showing green in the south-facing patches where the sun reached longest. The kind of change that didn't announce itself, just kept coming whether you were watching or not. "Clara," he said. "Yes?" He turned to look at her, and he had the expression that had been coming and going for weeks now, the one that looked like a man arriving at the edge of something he'd been walking toward for a long time, and finding, now that he was there, that the words he'd prepared were insufficient. "You asked me something," he said, "the night you came back from Red Hollow." She waited. "You asked why I walked away," he said. "Our wedding night, why I the distance, the back room." She had asked him that, weeks ago, the night after the meeting, in the strange open space that the day had created between them. He deflected, gently but completely, and she hadn't pushed it, because there were things she could push and things she couldn't, and she'd learned the difference. Now he was bringing it himself, which meant he was ready. She sat down. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her, and what was in his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, not broken, not dramatic, but genuinely open in a way that cost him something visible. "I made a promise to your father," he said, "when we agreed to the arrangement. I told him that I would never demand anything from you that you didn't freely choose. That the marriage, the everything about it, all of it would be your choice, your pace. I told him I would give you time and space to decide whether Blackthorn Valley and the man living here were something you wanted." Clara sat with that. She turned it over, looking at its edges, understanding its shape. "So you weren't rejecting me," she said slowly. "No," he said. "You were waiting," he said. "I was waiting for you to have time to actually decide. Not just be stuck with it because you'd agreed to something in a desperate moment and had no other option." She thought about her wedding night, about crying in the dark over the wooden bird, about the thin line of light under the door, about believing that his distance was his verdict on her, about how thoroughly she'd constructed the wrong story from the right pieces. "That was your first act of kindness," she said, "and I spent weeks thinking it was rejection." "I know," he said quietly. "I thought about telling you. Several times. I didn't know how. You could have..." She stopped. No, actually, she thought about January, about two strangers in a cold cabin, about everything neither of them had been yet to the other. "No, I don't know that I'd have believed you then." He nodded. He'd known that too, she suspected. He'd known and held it and waited and done it anyway. She looked at him, this man, who had built his entire approach to her around the question of what she wanted, who had made his own loneliness the cost of her freedom, who had never once said, "You owe me this," or "You're my wife now," or any of the 100 things a different man might have said. She thought about Lucy, and the birds, and the graves beneath the cottonwood. She thought about 30 miles in a blizzard, and a road taken out by ice, and a man who had arrived home at dawn, to find that being a few hours too late had cost him everything. She thought about how a person survives that, how they keep going. How they get up in the morning and chop wood and feed the livestock and fix the fence and do all the daily, ordinary work of staying alive inside a life that has been gutted. And she thought about what it must have felt like to have someone finally, after all of that, decide to stand up in a room full of people and say, "This man is not what you've been told." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He looked at her hand. He looked at her. She said, "I've decided." He didn't ask what she meant. He understood what she meant. She could see it in the way the set of his jaw changed, not relief exactly, or maybe relief was the wrong word for something that had no drama in it. That was simply the quiet arrival of something that had been moving toward them for months. His hand turned under hers. He held it. Outside, the valley moved through its slow, continuing change. The cottonwood stood at the edge of the clearing, old and enormous, its roots deep in the same ground that held Mara and Lucy, that held the gold beneath the ridge, that had held Gideon's refusal to leave through 6 years of pressure and isolation and grief. The same ground that Clara had walked into in January with 7 coins in her family's kitchen and a folded newspaper in her bag, and had decided, by slow degrees, to call her own. She held his hand, and the fire in the stove ticked, and outside a bird, she didn't know what kind, just one of the flying ones, crossed the window, quick and unrepeatable, and was gone. The hand-holding lasted about 30 seconds before Gideon pulled back and stood up and said he needed to check on the mare's shoulder, which was so perfectly, completely him that Clara almost laughed. She didn't. She let him go. She sat at the table for a moment with her hand still resting where his had been, and she thought, "This is what it looks like." Not the version in stories where the man declares himself and the woman accepts and the music swells and everything reorganizes itself into clarity. This is the actual version, where a person who has been alone for 4 years checks on a horse because he needs a minute to process having held someone's hand. She got up and started supper. He came back 20 minutes later, and his face was composed again. And they ate together at the table the way they'd been eating, for 3 months not silently anymore, not with the careful distance of strangers, but with the particular ease of 2 people who had stopped performing for each other and hadn't yet built the vocabulary for what they were becoming instead. They talked about the fence work Harlan Briggs had helped finish. They talked about the mare. She told him something her brother had written in the last letter that had made her laugh. And he listened with the kind of attention he gave, everything complete and unhurried, and at the end of it, the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was the closest thing to a smile he'd offered all week. It was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, exactly the right amount for where they were. April settled into May the way seasons do in mountain country, not with a clean handoff, but with a long argument between cold and warm that the warm eventually won on points rather than by knockout. The snow retreated to the high ridges and stayed there, And the pasture came in green, and the creek leveled off from its spring melt height, and the days got long enough that there was still light at supper. The visitors kept coming, though not in the overwhelming wave she'd half expected and half dreaded. They came in ones and twos in small family groups, with the tentative energy of people who were not entirely sure of their reception, but had decided to come anyway. Some of them brought things: food, tools, offers of labor. Some of them brought nothing but themselves and an apology that was delivered with varying degrees of skill and sincerity. Clara watched Gideon navigate all of it and learned something from watching. He was not gracious in the way of someone who had forgiven everything and held nothing. He was too honest for that, and she would have trusted him less if he'd performed a magnanimity he didn't feel. What he was instead was functional. He accepted the apologies that were genuine and found ways to redirect the ones that were really about the other person's comfort. He worked alongside the men who came to help without making it a moment of reconciliation, and without making it ordinary either. He occupied a specific and difficult middle ground, not closed off, not wide open, just present, just himself, taking things as they came. She thought this was, in its own imperfect way, more impressive than forgiveness would have been. The one that was hardest to watch was a man named Cecil Drummond, who had been on the town council when the original article ran and had made some public statements at the time that Clara knew about from the letters in Ellen Foltz's box. He came alone, on a Wednesday, driving a wagon he'd borrowed from somewhere because his own had a broken axle. And he sat in the yard on the upturned crate that had become the default visitor's seat and talked at Gideon for 20 minutes about the pressures he'd been under at the time and how difficult the situation had been from a community leadership perspective, and how he'd always had private doubts about the story. Clara, from the kitchen window, watched Gideon's face during all of this and understood that he was doing something very specific, was letting the man finish. Not agreeing, not absolving, just waiting with the patience of someone who had learned that some speeches need to be completed before the person giving them can hear anything else. When Drummond finally ran out of explanation, Gideon said, "I appreciate you coming out," which was not forgiveness, which was not absolution, which was not the warm embrace of a man who has let the past go. It was simply an acknowledgement that the man had made the drive, which was the thing Gideon could honestly offer, and he offered it without pretending it was more. Drummond left looking neither entirely satisfied nor entirely rejected, which was probably exactly right. Clara set down the pot she'd been stirring and decided she was very glad she'd married this particular man. The formal legal question resolved itself in June, and not dramatically. Webb had been as good as his word about the letters. He'd taken them to the county recorder, and the county had, after some deliberation of the bureaucratic kind that always took longer than it should, determined that the documented payments from Crow to the former editor constituted sufficient grounds for an inquiry into defamatory publication practices. There was a hearing scheduled in the county seat. Clara and Walter attended. Hollis attended. Ellen Foltz attended, and sat in the courtroom with the particular composure of someone who has carried something heavy for a long time and is finally setting it down on someone else's table. Crow was represented by lawyers who were expensive and careful and worked very hard to establish that the correspondence, while admittedly authored by their client, did not constitute explicit direction to print false information, and that any editorializing done by the paper's former editor was the editor's own independent decision. It was, Clara thought, an argument that sounded better in a law office than it did in a courtroom full of people holding the actual letters. The outcome was not a criminal conviction. Crow's lawyers were too good for that, and the law in those matters was imprecise enough to give them room to work. What it was, instead, was a formal finding of defamatory publication and a determination of damages owed to Gideon Rourke in an amount that was not enormous but was real. And, more importantly, a public record. The kind of document that travels. The kind of document that follows a man from county to county and makes the next group of investors ask questions before they commit. Crow paid the damages through his lawyers at arm's length without showing his face. Gideon used part of the money to repair the cabin roof properly, which had needed it since before Clara arrived. He put the rest in a lockbox without discussing what it was for, and when she asked him about it a month later, he said, "I'm thinking," and she let him think. It was Walter who told her what Gideon had been thinking, because Walter always knew things about Gideon that Gideon hadn't said yet, in the way of old friends who have watched each other long enough to read the planning before the plan. "He wants to write to your father," Walter said, on a July morning when he'd come up to help re-shingle the barn roof. About a loan, to get the Whitlock place back on its feet properly. Not a gift he knows your father wouldn't take it as a gift. A loan with no interest and no deadline. Clara looked at him. "He told you this?" "He told the fence post," Walter said, "in a conversation I happened to be near." Same thing, she sat with that, her father's hands counting 7 coins. Her mother's face set against the fear of the winter coming. Her brother's cough, the roof they'd repaired with money she hadn't known, Gideon had sent until her brother mentioned it in a letter, months later, as if it were a simple fact. "He doesn't tell me things," she said, "not as a complaint. Just as an observation." "No," Walter agreed, "he does them. There's a type of man who tells you what he's going to do and then does about half of it. Gideon's the other kind," he paused. "Gets frustrating." "But you always know where you stand." She thought about this. She thought about the coat on the wagon bench in January, about the stew left on the back of the stove, about the mare's stall built away from the creek, about the bedroom and the promise to her father, and 30 miles in a blizzard for a woman he loved with everything he had. "Yes," she said, "you do." That evening she raised it with Gideon directly, because she'd learned that the way through his silences was not to tiptoe around them, but to walk straight in. "Walter told me about the letter to my father," she said. They were doing dishes, which was the domestic activity that had become, over these months, the most consistently comfortable space for difficult conversations. Something about the task, the warm water, the ordinary work, made things easier to say. Gideon set down the dish he was drying. "I should have told you myself." "Yes," she said, "you should have, but I understand why you didn't." "Why? Because you weren't sure I'd let you," she said, "and you were going to do it regardless." A pause. "That's accurate. Write the letter," she said. "Write it how you want to write it. But tell me first what it says." He picked up the dish again. "Fair," he said. He wrote the letter the next night, at the table while she read. He showed it to her when he was done. It was 3 paragraphs, direct and clear, offering Thomas Whitlock the use of a sum that would cover the debts and allow for a season's proper planting, repayable when the farm was in good enough shape that repayment wouldn't strain it. The 3rd paragraph said, "Your daughter has been an asset to this ranch in more ways than I had the sense to anticipate. I want her to know her family as well." Clara read that last sentence twice. Then she handed it back. "Send it," she said. Her father wrote back in 3 weeks. His handwriting was steadier than it had been in years, she thought. Or maybe that was wishful thinking. He accepted the loan with the dignified formality of a man who understood that accepting help gracefully was its own kind of integrity. He said the roof was holding. He said her brother had started working the south field again. He said he hoped she was well, and that from her letters she sounded well, and that he thought about her every day. She read that part to Gideon at supper. He listened. He didn't say anything. But later, when she was at the window looking at the evening light on the ridge, she heard him in the back room, the room that had been his retreat, his too small cell of a room, and she heard something she hadn't heard from there before. Quiet, tuneless, barely sound at all. He was humming. Just a low wandering hum without melody or intention. The kind of sound a person makes when they're not performing for anyone, not managing anything, just existing in a moment that has come out better than expected. She turned back to the window so he wouldn't know she'd heard. Summer in Blackthorn Valley was a revelation she hadn't been prepared for, because she'd arrived in winter, and everything she knew about the place had been formed in cold and snow and the compressed gray light of January. The valley in summer was something else entirely wide open. Grass green, the creek running clear and the wildflowers coming in on the south slopes in colors she didn't have names for, and the evenings long and warm enough to sit outside without coats. They sat outside sometimes in the evenings, just the two of them, on the bench Gideon had built against the south wall of the cabin, where the wall held the day's heat. She would have a cup of tea, and he would have nothing, just his hands resting on his knees, and they would sit and watch the light change on the valley and talk, or not talk, with equal comfort. Those were the times she felt most clearly what they were building, not despite its imperfections, but through them, around them, in the spaces between them. It wasn't a marriage the way stories described marriage. There was no sweep of it, no single moment of arrival. It was more like what she'd seen in the long-married couples she'd observed in her childhood, the ones who'd been together so many years that they'd stopped needing to explain themselves and had become, instead, fluent in each other. She and Gideon were nowhere near that yet, but she could see the direction. One evening in late July, she asked him about Mara. Not about the storm, not about her death. She knew those facts now as well as she knew anything. She asked about before. What was she like? She said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet before speaking about anything that mattered, as if the words needed to come up from somewhere deep and he had to be patient with the ascent. She was funny, he said. Funnier than me. Funnier than most people. The kind of funny that sneaks up on you. You'd be in the middle of an ordinary conversation, and she'd say something, and it would take you a second to realize it was a joke, and by then she'd already moved on. He paused. She didn't need you to react to it. She just said the thing because it was true. Clara looked at the ridge. Did she like it here? She loved it, he said, with a directness that was different from his usual careful pace. She was from flat country. Her family's place was in the lowlands, not a hill for 30 miles. The first time she saw this valley, she just stopped. Stood there in the road and stopped. I asked her what was wrong, and she said nothing was wrong. She'd just never understood what wrong looked like until now. Clara looked at him. She meant the world without mountains. That's what she meant, he said. She thought about Clara Rourke, who had been funny and flat country born and had stood in this road and understood something new about the world. She thought about Lucy, 4 years old, and collecting feathers and calling everything that flew the flying ones with the uncomplicated delight of a child who has not yet learned that the world will eventually require more precision from her. She thought about what it meant to carry those people, really carry them, not as a weight that dragged you down, but as the thing that told you what was worth protecting. You kept this valley for them, she said. Partly, he said. And partly for yourself. Yes, he said without apology. Partly for myself. Because it was mine and because I'd built it, and because I wasn't going to let a man who'd done what Crow did take it from me. He paused. The grief and the stubbornness, they got tangled up. I'm not entirely sure which one kept me here. Does it matter? She said. Here. He looked at her. Evening light on his face, the particular gold of late summer, and the expression he wore was the open one, the one she'd seen that night at the table, when he'd taken her hand, and the one that came and went still. Not yet comfortable enough to stay, but coming more often than it had. You're here too, he said. I am, she said. That was not the plan, he said, when any of this started. It wasn't I wasn't expecting. He stopped, tried again. I thought I was practical enough to manage an arrangement. I thought the arrangement was all it would ever be. So did I, she said. And then you sent letters to people I'd helped and rode to town alone and stood up in front of the community that had spent 4 years deciding I was a monster and told them they were wrong, he said. And I had to revise quite a lot of what I thought I understood about what was possible. She turned to look at him fully. Is that your way of saying something? He met her eyes. The corner of his mouth moved. I suppose it is. You could try being more direct, she said. I could, he said. I love you. Is that direct enough? She felt those 3 words land not with the drama of a thunderclap, but with the particular weight of something true, something that had been true for a while and was only now being said, which gave it a weight that immediate declarations never quite have. 3 words from a man who used words like currency, spending them carefully because there were never enough of them when things went wrong. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. "Yes," she said. "That's direct enough." He covered her hand with his. They sat that way while the light went off the ridge, while the valley moved through the long summer dusk, while somewhere in the tree line a bird, one of the flying ones, called once and went quiet. Her family came in September. It was Gideon's idea, which surprised her less than it would have 6 months ago. He'd written to her father again, after the loan letter, a shorter note simply asking whether Thomas Whitlock might bring the family up to see the ranch before the autumn weather closed the road. He'd framed it as practical. There were things about the place they should know, things about Clara's situation that were better seen than described in letters. Clara had read the note before it was sent, and she understood what he wasn't saying, which was, "I want to give your daughter her family back. For a few days at least. I want her to not have to miss them at a distance." Her father came with her mother and her brother, who was 17 now, and had filled out from his sickness into someone she almost didn't recognize, broader, taller, with her father's jaw and his own stubborn look about the eyes. They arrived on a Tuesday in a borrowed wagon, and Clara was in the yard when they came up the road, and she crossed the distance at a pace that was not quite running, and found herself in her father's arms before she decided to go there. He held on for a long time. This man who had once smelled like cedar and honest work and had learned, in the years of drought and debt, to hold things lightly because holding things tightly only made it hurt more when they left. He was holding tightly now. She felt it, and it told her things that letters hadn't. Her mother cried, which was unusual. She was a woman who prided herself on not crying in front of people, and she apologized for crying, which was more usual. Her brother stood to the side with his arms crossed and the specific awkwardness of a teenage boy who is not sure whether the situation requires him to be emotional or not. And Clara solved the problem by crossing to him and hugging him despite his arms, and felt him, after a moment, uncross them and hug her back. Gideon stood near the barn door during all of this. Not absent present, clearly, just giving the moment its space. When Clara looked over at him, he gave her the small nod that was his version of "I know." Take your time, and she felt something in her chest that she'd been feeling for months now and had finally named correctly. Her father crossed the yard to shake Gideon's hand, and Gideon took it. And her father said something she didn't hear from where she was standing. And Gideon answered in the way of a man who understood that he was receiving something formal and intended to honor it. Whatever passed between them in those 2 minutes, it had the quality of a reckoning 2 men looking at each other across the fact of what they'd each done and what it had cost and what it had, in the end, produced. They stayed 4 days. It was not seamless. Her mother and Gideon did not find each other immediately. Her mother was warm in a way that tended toward words, and Gideon was warm in a way that tended toward action. And they spent the first 2 days in a gentle, mutual uncertainty before finding the middle ground, which turned out to be the kitchen. Her mother was an excellent cook. Gideon understood excellent cooking, with the specific appreciation of a man who had been feeding himself adequately for years without ever approaching excellent. They were fine after that. Her brother and Gideon were fine almost immediately, for the reason that 17-year-old boys and taciturn men of 40-something often find each other easy company they could work side by side without talking, and both find it comfortable. Gideon showed him the north fence on the 2nd day, and the ridge line on the 3rd, and by the 4th day, her brother was asking questions about the ranch, with the focused curiosity of someone who was calculating something he hadn't stated yet. Her father took a long walk on the 3rd morning, alone, and came back looking like he'd resolved something internal that he'd been carrying for a while. He found Clara in the yard that afternoon and stood beside her and said, without looking at her, "He's a good man." "He is," she said, I couldn't know that for certain when this started, her father said. I knew what people said. I knew what I hoped, but I couldn't know. I know, she said. I'm sorry that you had to go in without knowing, he said. That it was the only choice we had. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, at the way the September light came across it in the long, slanted way of autumn approaching. He was doing the thing he'd done her whole life, which was apologizing for circumstances beyond his control, as if apology were the only form of honesty available to a person who had done his best and found it insufficient. Papa, she said, look at where I am. He looked at her. Look at where I am, she said again. He did, and she watched him see it, the valley. The cabin, the barn in good repair, the cottonwood at the edge of the clearing. She watched him understand that the thing he'd sent her into out of desperation had become, through a route neither of them could have mapped in advance, a life. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into it. You did well, he said, better than I had any right to hope. So did you, she said. You raised someone stubborn enough to make it work. He laughed the loud, surprised laugh that she remembered from before the drought, the laugh that had gone quiet over the hard years and was coming back now. She could hear it. One instance at a time. After the family left, the valley was different. Not worse better, actually. Fuller. As if something that had been almost right had found the last missing piece and settled. The cabin, which had been quiet in the particular way of a space that held only one person's history, now had Clara's family in it even when they were gone, in the stories told during those 4 days. In the cup her mother had found in the back of the pantry and washed and placed precisely in the wrong spot, and Clara had left there on purpose. In the chair her father had sat in the most which had developed a tendency to be where Clara sat when she was reading now. She and Gideon fell into a new rhythm that autumn, one that was different from the careful early months and different from the tense spring of crow and letters and the meeting. Quieter than all of that. Ordinary in the way that real life is ordinary morning coffee and fence work and supper and evenings on the bench and the first frost and the preparations for winter that had to be made before the cold came in earnest. But ordinary differently. She had learned to read the differences. He brought her coffee before she asked for it now, which she understood was a form of paying attention. She had learned the specific quality of silence that meant he was troubled by something versus the quality that meant he was simply thinking, and she'd learned which one to interrupt and which to leave alone. They argued twice in October once about the wisdom of a plan she had for redirecting the creek drainage away from the south fence, and once about a letter she wanted to send to the county paper, responding to a follow-up piece about the crow situation that had gotten some facts wrong. Both arguments were real arguments, with raised voices, and the specific frustration of two people who were each certain they were right. And both of them ended not with one person capitulating, but with a third option neither had thought of initially, arrived at through the argument itself. She decided this was probably the healthiest possible sign. November brought the first real snow, and with it Walter, who came up the valley road with his mule cart, looking like a man who had something to deliver and had been thinking about how to deliver it the entire ride. He had a letter, not from Crow that correspondence had stopped in the summer, the lawyers having apparently advised their client that further engagement was counterproductive. This letter was from an attorney at the county seat, advising that the formal inquiry into the defamatory publication had concluded with a permanent public record of the finding, that Crow's business registration in the county had been allowed to lapse without renewal, and that there was no outstanding legal claim against Gideon Rourke or his property from any party. Walter laid the letter on the table and looked at Gideon, who read it twice and set it down. "That's it," Clara said. "That's it," Walter said. She looked at the letter. She looked at Gideon. She waited for herself to feel something large triumph or relief, or the particular elation of a long effort concluded. What she felt instead was the same quiet she'd felt in the yard when Walter told her Crow was leaving. Clean, finished, like a door closing not with a slam but with a solid click of a well-fitted latch. So it's over, she said. It's over, Walter confirmed. Gideon stood up. He crossed to the window, and she watched his back, and she thought about a year ago when that back had been turned in the permanent posture of a man who had given up on the world behind him. It was different now. She couldn't have named precisely how, but it was the shoulders carried differently, the spine held differently, something in it less like a wall and more like a person. I want to do something, Gideon said to the window. She waited. The graves, he said. I want to put proper stones. Carved ones, not what I cut myself, actual stones with a mason's work, he turned. I've been thinking about it since the summer. Mara and Lucy deserve better than what's there. Clara looked at him. Then we'll get proper stones. It won't bring... He stopped. It doesn't change anything. About what happened? No, she said. But it says something about now. And now is what we have. He looked at her for a moment. You have a habit of saying things that are simple and also correct, he said. I have a habit of saying things that are simple, she said. You're the one who decides they're correct. Fair distinction, he said. Walter, who had been drinking his coffee through all of this, with the focused attention of a man pretending to be invisible, stood up. I know a mason in the county seat, he said. Does good work. I'll write to him. Thank you, Walter, Clara said. Don't thank me, he said, reaching for his coat. I've been waiting for that man to tend to those graves properly for 3 years. It's a relief to finally have someone here with the sense to ask for it. He left before Gideon could respond, which was probably his intention. The stones arrived in the spring. April again, almost exactly a year from the meeting in Red Hollow, which Clara noted privately without mentioning because some coincidences are better held than shared. The mason had done good work. The stones were gray granite, fitted to the ground in a way that would hold against the seasons, and the lettering was clean and deep. Mara's stone said what it had always said, Clara Rourke. Beloved, Lucy's was changed, though. Gideon had thought about it through the winter and decided. It said, Lucy Rourke. She knew the flying ones. Clara stood in front of that stone in the April mud and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for. Not grief, exactly not the primary grief that was Gideon's to carry, that she would never take from him. Something more like honor, the recognition of a life brief enough to hold in 2 hands and still particular enough to leave a mark. Gideon stood beside her. They were close but not touching, not because of distance between them, but because some things you stand next to and don't hold on to, you just stand there. She would have been 8 this year, he said. Tell me something she would have done at 8, Clara said. He thought about it. Argued, he said. She'd started arguing at 3. By 8, she would have been impossible. Something in his voice was different from the other times he'd talked about Lucy, less careful. Less like handling glass. She would have argued about everything, which way to ride the fence, what to call the chickens, why supper had to be at a particular time. She would have had opinions about everything and expressed them at full volume. She sounds exhausting, Clara said. She was, he said. She was the best thing I ever knew. They stood there for a while. Cottonwood's branches had started to bud, pale green against the gray sky. The creek ran high on the other side of the clearing, and somewhere above them a bird she'd gotten better at naming them over the past year. But this one was too far up to see, clearly was calling in that particular way of spring birds, urgent and repetitive, insisting on something. I want to plant something here, Clara said, around the stones. When the ground is ready, what kind? I don't know yet. Something that comes back every year. She paused. Something with color. He nodded. All right. They walked back to the cabin together, through the spring mud and the thin morning light, and she thought about a year. 1 year from January to April, from a wagon bench in the snow to standing in the clearing where the people he loved were buried. 1 year of learning a person from the outside in the coat and the stew and the careful silence, and then the letters and the arguments and the hand at the table, and then all the rest of it. All the complicated dailiness of 2 people choosing each other incrementally, imperfectly, without the benefit of a story that told them how it was supposed to go. She thought about what she would tell the version of herself who had sat on that wagon bench in January with a newspaper in her bag and fear in her chest, heading up a mountain toward a stranger. She would say, "You're going to cry on your wedding night, but not for the reason you think." She would say, "The man you're afraid of is afraid of you too, in a different way, for different reasons. And it will take you a while to understand that, and the understanding will change everything." She would say, "The hardest part isn't the mountain or the cold or the newspaper or even Crow. The hardest part is deciding that another person's truth is worth fighting for when you're still figuring out your own." She would say, "You'll figure it out, not cleanly, not without arguments and mistakes and moments where you get it badly wrong. But you'll figure it out." What happened to Blackthorn Valley over the year that followed was not the transformation that stories promise. It was slower and more irregular than that, which is to say it was real. The community of Red Hollow did not collectively wake from its long error and become a different kind of place overnight. People revised themselves at their own individual speeds, which varied enormously, and a few never revised at all and simply avoided Blackthorn Valley without public acknowledgement of why. But some things changed durably. The Briggs family became genuine neighbors in the way the word is supposed to mean, the way that means you don't wait for an invitation, and you don't keep formal track of what's owed in either direction. Harlan, Briggs, and Gideon developed, over the course of a year of working alongside each other on the various problems that adjacent land always creates, the specific friendship of men who find in each other someone they can work with without translation. It was not deep conversation. It was better than deep conversation. It was the kind of knowing that happens through action rather than words. Dr. Hollis came up in the autumn and examined Clara and reported what she already suspected and drove back to Red Hollow having delivered the news that Blackthorn Valley would have a new resident by the following summer. He did not congratulate Gideon in the formal way, because Hollis had known Gideon long enough to understand that formal congratulations would land awkwardly. Instead, he shook his hand at the wagon and said, "That valley needed a future. I'm glad it's getting one." Gideon stood in the yard after Hollis drove away and did not say anything for a long time. Clara was at the cabin door watching him. She saw the moment it fully arrived in him, the fact of it, the weight and the lightness of it together, the way good things can feel frightening when you have spent long enough expecting only the other kind. He turned around. She was already crossing the yard toward him. Because she'd learned, over a year of reading this man, when to wait and when not to. He held on. That was all. He just held on. One hand against the back of her head, the way you hold something you had stopped believing you would ever have again. And she could feel the whole of him, and that hold the grief and the stubbornness and the 30 miles in a blizzard and the years of silence and the birds carved in the evenings and everything that had made him who he was, all of it present in the simple, not at all simple act of holding on. She held on too. The following summer, the valley filled with sound. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just in the accumulation of ordinary things, the Briggs children who came with their parents and ran in the yard with the particular loud freedom of children who have been given outdoor space and no particular instructions, the sound of Walter's cart coming up the road, and Walter himself arguing good-naturedly with everyone about everything. Her mother's voice when the family visited in July, and she took over the kitchen with the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting to cook in a proper kitchen all winter. And underneath all of that, persistent and ordinary and irreplaceable, Clara's laughter, which had always been there, but had grown easier in this place, more frequent, less guarded. The laughter of a woman who had arrived in January, not knowing if she was brave enough for what was being asked of her, and had discovered, through the long, uncertain work of a year, that brave enough was not a fixed quality you either had or didn't. It was something you built, inch by inch, in the specific daily choices of whether to send the letter or keep it, whether to stand up or stay seated, whether to reach across the table or keep your hands in your lap. Gideon would sometimes look up from whatever he was doing, the fence work, the tack repair, the reading at the table, and find her in the yard or the kitchen or in the clearing by the cottonwood, and watch her for a moment with the expression that had started as uncertainty and become, over months and miles of distance closed, something she now recognized as simple love. Not the uncomplicated kind, the other kind, the kind that knows exactly what it's looking at, costs and all, and chooses it anyway. Mara's stone and Lucy's stone stood clean under the cottonwood through rain and sun and the first snow of the following winter. The flying ones. Clara planted wild columbine around them in the spring, and it came back as she'd hoped. Year after year, purple and gold against the gray stone, stubborn and returning, the way things do when they've found the right ground. She had thought, in January, that she was being sent into something. She had thought she was being traded, sacrificed, dispatched to a life she hadn't chosen by circumstances she couldn't change. And maybe that was the beginning of it, the raw, practical, desperate beginning that she didn't get to choose. But she had chosen everything since. That was the part no one had seen from the outside. Every letter, every step down that mountain road toward a room full of people who had decided on a story, every conversation at the kitchen table, and every evening on the south bench, and every moment of reaching toward a man who had learned to expect nothing, and was slowly, imperfectly, uncertainly learning to expect something again. She had chosen it. And choice, she had come to understand not the perfect kind, not the kind made from a position of freedom and full information, but the kind made in the middle of uncertainty with incomplete evidence and real fear. That kind of choice was the only kind that meant anything. Anyone could choose well when choosing was easy. The thing that mattered was what you did when it wasn't. What you did when the floor disappeared. What you did when someone handed you a newspaper on your wedding day and the man you'd just married turned his back and started walking toward the mountain. What you did when you were standing in a wedding dress in front of a crowd of people who pitied you. You had two options, and one of them was the wagon. She had gotten on the wagon. She would get on it again. Every day, in one form or another, you got on the wagon. That was all it was. That was everything it was. Blackthorn Valley stretched out on all sides of the cabin, green in summer and white in winter, and that impossible gold in the in-between times. And it was hers and his and theirs in the specific way that places become yours, not through ownership, but through all the days you've spent inside them, through the grief you've carried there, and the truth you've told there, and the life you've slowly, stubbornly, imperfectly built. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.